So hi and welcome to yet another episode of Casted. Our guest today is Robin Hanson, and one of my favorite Robin Hanson quotes about Robin Hanson goes something along these lines. Whenever I talk to an economist and they tell me about their work, my reaction is something like, maybe, and then I forget about it. But when I talk to Robin Hanson, my reaction is, no way, impossible, and then I think about it for the rest of the year. So, Robin, welcome to this conversation.
I hope I can live up to that.
Yeah, great to be here. Or are you actually here? Because we might actually have this conversation entirely in virtual reality. We will find out. So, Robin has done a lot of work about many things. Prediction markets, a recent book about social psychology, maintains a very interesting blog about overcoming bias. But the reason I wanted you here is to talk about mind uploading. And that's the result of Robin's first book, The Age of M.
Work, love, and life when robots rule the earth.
Very nice. This is almost a talk show ready quality now. So this appears now even in...
There's a paperback version, which is slightly revised and better, so it's cheaper. Might as well get the paperback.
More words.
20% longer.
And now it's also available electronically, which was not the case in the beginning?
Yes, in Europe at least. There's a ebook.
Oh.
So Amazon and Oxford have a bit of falling out in terms of agreeing on pricing and things like that. So
I successfully downloaded an electronic version of it.
Great.
Mm-hmm. So The Age of M, it's about mind uploading or whole brain emulation that this is sometimes called.
Right.
And there's a lot of ground to be covered, including the premises for this entire conversation.
Yes.
Which I want to get out of the way quite quickly, because otherwise it's kind of a black hole where we stay for a long time. So maybe just the two-word summary of what this universe is that we talked about.
I only get 2 words.
Well, and then you will get back to it in order to structure this. 2 sentences then. Yeah.
So we're not talking about the usual kind of robots or automation based on machine learning or statistics or software. We're imagining a different way to make robots as smart as people. And the concept here is like porting software. So if you want to have a new computer running software that's like on an old computer, you could try to write software like how you think it works, or you could write an emulator on the new machine that emulates the new machine for the old one, and then you just put the software in the new machine and it just works because it thinks it's on the old machine. So the idea is to do that for the human brain, to make an emulator for the software that's in our brain.
So can I just confuse emulation with simulation, or is there an important difference between these words?
Not especially important for this context.
Good. But emulation in the way that we can emulate an old Nintendo game on a new computer,
right.
So the game doesn't know the difference.
Right. We want to scan the brain and see what all cells are where, connected to what, how. We want to know the type of each cell, and then we want a computer model of how each type of cell works. And then we can put that all together to be a model of the whole brain with the same input-output behavior. That's the definition of an emulation, is it has the same input-output behavior in the same situation. So it's a very human-like thing, but it's implemented in artificial hardware, so it has a number of artificial advantages. And so that's the key working assumption. And the key thing to notice is this is a pretty specific assumption. If you just think about what is a future of robots like, you have to make a lot of assumptions in general about, well, what are robots like? How are they built? How are they structured? How do they behave? What do they want? These kind of robots are very easy to understand because they are basically humans, and we know a lot about humans.
But when you say robots, I already see kind of roughly humanoid physical entities walking around. The robots here don't necessarily have an embodied component.
So from the emulation's point of view, they would typically have a body and be in a space, but it would typically be a virtual space. And so they would see themselves as embodied and naturally, just like you or I, in a space that matters for them, but it might not be a physical space.
They will not be confused about this. We're not cheating them.
No, of course not.
So the emulated minds here, the simulated minds, the uploaded brains, whatever we want to call them, actually you have a good word for this, and let's just stick to
EMS.
that. EMS. EM.
Short for emulation.
Short for emulation. So these uploaded minds, which we now refer to as EMS, live and are completely they know they live in a virtual reality. Right. Some of them may be in robots.
Right. So from our distant ancestors' point of view, you and I live in pretty virtual environments in the sense that the space we're in is not at all natural. And the space we're in, say, has these walls and paintings and coverings, and underneath this fabric here and behind the paint here, there are artificial structures that support it all, but we don't care about that. We don't think about that much. We like this artificial space we're in. We know it's artificial. We know this isn't a natural environment. We like it.
Could be abhorrent to our ancestors.
Well, it would be strange, certainly, an alien. They wouldn't see us living in a natural world. They'd see us in a strange artificial world. And the Ims are in the same way. They know they're in an artificial world. It's a world they like, so they're okay with it.
Okay, so this is the premise. A whole brain emulation, simulated minds that live mostly in virtual reality. And I read a lot of science fiction, so now I know exactly what we envision now.
It's an old concept in science fiction.
It's an old concept, and since I devour that genre quite a lot, I know exactly what I should imagine in this world. So some of the parameters are. Let me just pretend I haven't read your book.
Okay.
There are no material needs. Anything that can be thought of can basically be simulated. So if I want a new car or a house at the beach in California or on Greenland, I can just get that at no more price than downloading new software to my video game. If I want my own planet, I can certainly get that. So there are no constraints to the material or imagined or simulated material reality I'm in. So everybody is, so this is one example of a so-called post-scarcity society where there is no material desire that makes any sense because you can just invent this. So everybody will walk around having amazing opportunities for self-expression. The world will be highly diverse. People will hunger for the pursuit of pleasure, and the only remaining there will be no wars. There is no illness. There is no death. We will be immortal. We could all look like Brad Pitt or Wonder Woman or the Balrog of Moria, and everybody would be filthy rich. And the only problem left would be to find meaning in this endless bombardment of pleasure,
or perhaps fight for status and recognition
in the huge video game that this world has become.
Right.
So I think everything I said right now was wrong.
What you've described is a common story setting that people would place this sort of technology in. And I like to say my book is like science fiction, except there's no plot and there's no characters, and it all makes sense. And so my personal frustration with science fiction over the years is, initially when I was a naive teenager, it was fun because I didn't know any better. And the more I've learned about the world, the more I realize that a lot of science fiction just doesn't make sense if you think about it. The world doesn't hold together, it doesn't work.
Which is really strange because a lot of science fiction is informed and sometimes written by people with a highly scientific mindset who take meticulous...
So that's called hard science fiction.
Yep.
And often they're hard about physics or even computer science, but they're not very hard about social science usually, because they don't usually know much social science. And in fact...
Because it's written by nerds for nerds,
right.
And they are really careful about getting the physics right.
When I was a physics undergraduate, I was basically told by my professors, those people in that other building across campus called social science, they're making it up. They don't know anything. That's not real science.
That's finger painting or something, right?
Right. A lot of hard science people have been told basically social science doesn't exist. So they don't think there's anything to know really about social science. They think their own intuitions is the best you could possibly do.
And you were here and you have a background in physics. You have a master's in physics from...
I do, yeah.
From Chicago.
And then I did 9 years of computer research.
Yeah, so you are one of the good guys who actually knows what science is.
Then I got a PhD in social science, and I'm now a professor of economics. And so I know that we know a lot of economics, and I've tried to describe a scenario where the economics make sense.
So this is, in some sense, the main idea behind this book. Let's take this so far fictional scenario of this single technology working, brain uploading, and then let's leverage what we know about social science and everything else, by the way,
and make it make sense.
And make
all the
it
way
make
through,
sense
as far as we can. Of course, I'm sure I'm going to get some things wrong, but it's based on the best sciences I understand. So I'm not trying to be creative or original in most of these things. I'm asking an unusual question, but I'm just trying to apply standard tools, Econ 101, Chemistry 101, Electrical Engineering 101, etc., all the way through to draw standard conclusions. So, of course, our listeners here are wondering, yes, but what's wrong about the story you just told? So the key thing to notice is that he was assuming everything was free, and in some sense, the physical environment is free, and as you said, you can have luxurious castles, you can have gold shiny things, you can have silk all the time if you want. All those physics things, fine, except every minute of experience you have to pay for. So,
but this is true today as well, right?
Yes, but it gets a lot more expensive in this world. So,
why? This is the thing that is hard to understand.
So, in history, almost all humans who have ever lived near subsistence level. That is, they had to work most of the time just to make enough to survive. And that was true for almost all animals who have ever lived as well. Almost all creatures who have ever lived have lived near subsistence level. And almost you and I and most everyone we know are not living near subsistence
So
level.
this is a
We're
really,
in a strange world.
really
compared to
strange
history.
species and really strange world.
And you're used to it and you like it and you feel entitled to it. And so you feel like the future is going to keep it. But you're not guaranteed to keep it.
So, but why did this happen?
So the key concept here is that population can grow. And so if we're above a subsistence level, say we can earn more than subsistence, if the population rate can grow faster than the economy, faster than our ability to produce food and subsistence, then the ratio of population to subsistence increases.
Do we need to explain subsistence at this word? So subsistence is sort of the minimum for
right,
survival.
Right.
The level you want to be above to not worry about whether you or your children die tomorrow from
Right, so
hunger or
if you need to work basically all of your time just to get enough food to survive and resources to survive, you're near subsistence. But you and I, in principle, we could subsist working just a couple hours a week and live very cheaply somewhere else, and many people do. So we are well above subsistence, but most people did not. And the key thing that's made us be above subsistence, did not. And the key difference is, in the last few hundred years, we've grown wealth faster than population. So the ratio of wealth to population has been increasing.
So previously, the economy and the population sort of kept track with each other whenever
because
the economy
grew slower than the population could, and so if
for,
ever
for
there was
purely physical reasons,
right,
because
exactly. So if ever there was an imbalance, say a pandemic killed a lot of people, then for a time wealth was higher than population, and then the population grew more quickly than wealth did, and so put it back into balance. And that's the standard Malthusian story, that in history, if ever people got temporarily rich, they didn't stay rich long,
like
because
from agriculture or any of the other great inventions that made the economy grow.
Right.
One generation later.
On average, during the farming era, or the last 10,000 years up until a few years ago, human economy population doubled roughly every 1,000 years, which was much faster than it did before farming era, when it doubled roughly every 250,000 years. But still, the population can grow faster than doubling every 1,000 years.
So just to make sure, when you say the economy is growing and talk about a pre-industrial society, what is measured here?
Well, the easy measure is population.
But now it's sort of circular.
Well, because people stayed near subsistence level the whole time, and so in fact population did track the economy because it was in a subsistence world, and that's a nice easy thing about the subsistence world. So that's history. History was up until a few hundred years ago, we were mostly living near subsistence. There were a small fraction of rich people, but the typical person was near subsistence, and that's been true for almost all animals, almost all humans. And then suddenly we figured out how to grow wealth faster than population.
Thanks to the Industrial Revolution.
Exactly. And many people love that, and it's great, and many people expect it to continue into the future. And I don't think we're going to grow wealth slower. I mean, if suddenly we stopped being able to grow wealth, we ran out of inventions, then that would be a problem there. But I think the problem is actually we figure out ways to grow population faster. And that's what happens in the age of M. So emulations are running on computers. And so in order to make more emulations, what you need is more computer hardware. But we can make computer hardware in factories. And we can make stuff in factories fast. In fact, we can grow factories fast. So the typical factory today produces as much value as the factory itself contains in just a few months. So the in principle doubling time of the wealth and things that are in factories today is a few months. The reason the economy doesn't double every few months is because labor doesn't double every few months. When we make more factories and things in factories, eventually we have more than we need. We can't use that many machines.
And labor now is M's.
People. Well, today labor is people, and then in the M world, M's produce the labor. And so now we don't need biological humans to produce the labor anymore in the M world. The M's who run on computer hardware, they produce the labor, and now the economy of M's can grow much more quickly.
So then the naive question would be, why would they be so stupid? As to get back into the Malthusian trap of growing the population as quickly as they can.
So we economists usually study worlds where no one's in charge. Many people find this odd to think about, but in fact, in our world, for most things, no one's in charge. No one is actually choosing world characteristics like which computer technologies get introduced where and the price of various things. Basically, each local organization or person makes choices in their personal interest with foresight to choose what they want. But the net effect of all those choices can be things that not only don't most people want, perhaps nobody wants. So far in history, most technology has just appeared when anybody anywhere thought it was a good idea and could implement it, and there wasn't a global veto. And so the world we have seen is the net result of all those people introducing all the technologies they each saw as their interest, even when that, for example, produced a Malthusian world. So again, until a few hundred years ago, the whole world could have restrained population growth, say, and then it could have gotten rich per person, but they didn't.
Okay, so the answer to my question why the M world would fail to restrict population is the same question as why did we fail to restrain population after we invented agriculture. We obviously didn't do that, and even if, I don't know, Belgium, which didn't exist then, had decided to do that, then Belgium would have been overrun by the neighboring country that decided to not do that.
The sparsely populated rich Belgians would then face a war, for example, with the dense neighboring poor whatever,
Dutch,
and lost.
So they would die eating delicious chocolate, but they would still lose.
And so, again, in the M world, I analyze the M world as if no one's in charge. So I use our standard economic analysis tools of supply and demand to say what's likely to happen if each local group does what's in their interest.
The local group could be nations, or it could be
at the
companies,
highest level, companies, families,
so
etc.
no one is in charge still means that that there are
no
the normal hierarchies.
There's no global veto on introducing population or technologies. It just happens that individuals find it in their interest.
There is no global mechanism to solve the global coordination problem, that if we solve that, everybody would be better off, because then we would have my science fiction world where we would all run around.
I'll have to admit, eventually we may get better at coordination and produce a world where we do coordinate at a global level on these things, and then it becomes harder to predict that world, because now we have to know, well, what do these global people want?
And that's an interesting avenue of exploration, but that's not what your book is about.
And so the key thing to notice is, so you might ask, it's a strange world, how could I predict what happens in the strange world? And a key thing is that a Malthusian world is just an easier world to predict than a rich world. So to predict our world, say, from 1,000 years ago, you would not just have to know that we have cars and factories and airplanes, you'd also have to know what we want. Because rich people choose what they want, because they can. Poor people don't have a choice. Poor people have to do what it takes to survive. That limits the range of their available behavior, which makes them much more predictable, which is why I can tell you about the age of M. I don't need to know that much about what M's want to tell you what they do. They do what it takes to survive.
Good, so let me summarize this again. So what we have now is this idea of being able to simulate human brains, run them in virtual environments, copy them. That seems to be
very important.
That seems to fall out of the basic idea that we can run brains on other substrates. So clearly the transition from taking, say, my physical fatty brain and running that on a different computer is a more dramatic assumption than running another copy of my brain. So it seems to follow that.
We're assuming, in essence, you can separate your brain into hardware and software, and the software can be copied onto other hardware.
Let's be really careful with this, because so brains are not universal computing devices that just differ in how the neurons fire, because a lot of the functionality of the brain we know today is embodied in some physical phenomenon like the anatomy of certain neurons. This you would still classify as software, right?
So there are different kinds of brain cells, and they operate in different ways, but there could be some more general hardware that is able to mimic the different kinds of brain cells as specified. And so the specification of a brain would specify which cells are where, connected to what, of what type, and then what internal state they each have. And then a general brain emulator hardware could run that. It could take the specification of which cells were where, of what type, and run it and produce a emulation of the process which has the same input-output behavior, i.e. you hook it up with artificial eyes and ears and hands and mouth, and then you could talk to it, it talks back, you ask it to do things, it might do them, just as the original would in the same situation. That's the idea of an emulation, and the assumption is that that is the result of brain cells which are relatively generic, which have special states, and that could be encoded in basically a computer file.
And what you just described is more or less currently the consensus in neuroanatomy, or even a strong branch of philosophy that says that the brain, this is all there is on the brain. There is no extra brain spirit that makes you run.
Well, so those topics are of enormous interest to many people, So much so that pretty much any time this concept of emulation or uploads comes up, the conversation goes there.
Yeah.
People talk about whether an emulation of you is you, whether they're conscious, when it would happen. And I wanted to avoid that conversation. So I said the neglected topic was what would actually happen in this world. And so I chose specifically in this book to just set those questions aside and talk about what would happen. So by definition, an emulation does the same thing in the same situation from the outside. It looks like a person feeling and doing things. I'm not going to make a claim about whether it really is, because whether or not it really is, it will seem so, and that will create a world that seems a certain way. And I wanted to say, what does that world seem like?
Still, these are super fascinating topics, but they're not. The reason for us not to talk about them is not that we find them boring, but
No,
but
I wanted to get past that.
Yeah, you want
and
to
have
get
something
past
new
that,
to
yes,
say.
yes.
And I
So-
do think I did have something new to say.
and indeed you did. So by just taking this assumption that this can be done seriously, you arrive with this single. Maybe there are two assumptions, right? The assumption is that we can simulate brains, and then a secondary assumption is that we can copy them and we can run them at different speeds as well. These things
Right.
seem to follow from the idea of running them on a different substrate.
It's the idea you can separate a computer file specification of a particular brain and then a more general piece of hardware that could run many different brains, and then you could move this computer file around. You could make a copy of the file, you could send it somewhere else and put it on a new piece of hardware somewhere else, and then that would now behave like the original would, but now on a different piece of hardware, and then now they can diverge with differing experiences. So that's, and of course the final assumption is, and this is cheap enough.
And this is cheap enough.
Right, because
In
if it's too
particular-
expensive, it doesn't matter.
Good. So I want to spend a bit of time talking about these assumptions and maybe just mention timescales or something like that. And after that, we can finally delve into what you're here for. But I
Right.
know from
Sure, absolutely.
having annoyed many people over lunch conversations with exactly
They
these topics.
want to be careful.
We
with
want
the
to be
assumptions.
careful and ignoring these pressing issues of computational theory of mind and
Right.
personality and self and so on just seems to ring false to many people. We're not ignoring them because we don't find them interesting. We're ignoring them because there's something even more interesting to talk about instead. And we
Right.
have finite time.
And that whatever the answers to those questions are, this other question is still a relevant, interesting question.
Good.
Right.
So it's an orthogonal.
Right.
Right. It's
You
an
can still say, what does this world look like?
what does this world look like? And this is really surprising that we can do that, and we will get there in a minute.
Right.
A previous guest on the podcast, Ole Hegström, actually just wrote a paper about mind uploading, where he calls this book the the unchallenged masterpiece in this niche of
I'll have to read this paper.
Yes, unchallenged masterpiece. So far, unchallenged masterpiece in the niche of non-fiction descriptions of this
Well,
world.
that's a virtue of being weird.
Yeah.
Do something weird enough, and
It is,
then nobody
yeah.
will challenge
Yeah,
you for it.
it is really weird. Also, after finishing it the first time, I was not sure I liked it, but I did find out that I like other books way less because this does
Set a
take
higher standard.
It does take the topic very, very seriously. So quickly about assumptions. So let's just assume that neuroanatomy is right and the brain is really just a physical
Right.
object. We are not sure about whether this is on which level of detail we need to simulate a brain cell.
So let me make the stronger claim that from biological evolution's point of view, each organ in the body has a function. And each organ, the evolution's mainly selection pressure is on achieving the function, and then there's other features each organ has, and those are mainly selection to reduce cost and produce reliability. That is, your heart mainly pumps, and so evolution tried to make it into a good pump, but of course it's also floppy and it's also needs sources, and so we can think of each organ as in terms of its function, and then if we wanted to replace it, we would mainly focus on replacing the function, and we wouldn't really need to replace the other parts, and in fact the other parts would be superfluous if we could achieve the function without those other parts. And so similarly for the brain, the key story is the brain's function is to process signals. That's what it does, that's what evolution cared about, and so yes, the brain has many other details, but those details didn't matter that much from the point of view of what evolution was trying to achieve in a brain. And if we replace a brain, all we need to replace is the function, and then we can slot it in, and that replacement will now achieve the same function. And so the key claim is that the brain's function is to process signals, i.e. take signals in, change internal state, send signals out. And so we know many things about signal processing systems engineering. In other contexts, we have phones and computers and other sorts of devices, and we know that in general signal processing systems have a limited number of degrees of freedom which represent the signals, and then they have many other degrees of freedom that represent the infrastructure necessary to support that, and they typically try to separate those degrees of freedom. They typically try to isolate the degrees of freedom that represent the signals and the stored state from the many other degrees of freedom which, if they interacted too strongly, would simply wash out the signal. And so, in a computer there is a wire and an insulators around the wire, and the whole point of having a wire and insulators around the wire is to insulate the wire, the signal states in the wire, from the other states of the system. And so the brain seems to be designed in that same way. That is, brains, cells send signals, they store signals, and they have many, many other degrees of freedom. But the idea is, if a brain cell is like the other signal processing engineered systems we know, we expect it to be designed to isolate the key degrees of freedom that represent the signals from the other degrees of freedom, and therefore we don't expect to need to model all those other degrees of freedom in much detail. We only expect to need to model the key degrees of freedom that represent the signals.
So that's the optimistic viewpoint.
Right.
The pessimistic viewpoint would be that we will never understand what actually goes on from a signal processing perspective in the brain. So we need to simulate every single cell.
In which case the cost will be enormous, and it will take a lot longer before this is feasible. And so now eventually it would become feasible, but a key assumption implicit here, which we'll now make explicit, is that this is the first kind of robot as smart as people. If other kinds of robots as smart as people are cheaper than this and cheaper first, the scenario plays out very differently. In this scenario, since this is the first kind of robot as smart as people, there's an enormous demand for these. And they basically take over the economy and do most of the work. That isn't true if we have other kinds of robots as smart as people that are even cheaper at the same time.
Or other kinds of artificial intelligence.
Right,
Can we
that's
just
what I mean,
take that footnote that there might be a completely different way of achieving artificial intelligence, which is, say, understanding symbolic reasoning better and doing it in a completely different way.
And if that happens
evolution
first, then this scenario doesn't play out really like this. So this is under these assumptions that this not only happens, but happens first.
And there would be another nice book to write about the other scenario where some other kind of artificial intelligence arrives earlier.
And
this is not even AI, right?
Exactly.
This is,
and I'll say, if it's worth having 100 books about the future, it's worth having a book about a scenario that has a 1% chance. So I don't need to make a strong claim about the probability of the scenario to make the book interesting and worth writing. And so I don't try to make a strong claim. I actually think it's pretty likely, but I don't need to convince you of that to tell you that this is a book worth reading.
Oh, I read many books with a lower standard of worth reading. It's just I found it highly informative. I found it highly informative just because I learned a lot about social science. Because one of the nice aspects of the book is that you start there is something about physics, and there is something about psychology, and there's something about sociology and economics and so on. And there are very nice introduction to what standards consensus science about this particular area tells us about the world today and history, and from these assumptions, what can we say about the M world. So this was the principle of emulating a brain, and then we need to emulate it in so some kind of intellectual breakthrough in brain science is needed in order to write down this functionality that you just described.
Well, it would be a breakthrough at the cell level. That is, you'll need to have good enough models of cells. And I'll have to say, we now have pretty decent models of some kinds of cells, but you need it for all the kinds of cells. And so it's a approachable task in that sense. It's not beyond what the kind of thing we've already done. We just have to do a lot more of it. So this is more of a scaling thing. We just have to do a lot more of the kind of thing we've already done we don't necessarily need a new conceptual breakthrough to achieve this.
No, we just have to continue doing
a lot more of what we have.
Of what we do. And we do that. I mean, there are active fields of research that try to understand exactly this kind of questions.
So we need a lot more computers, bigger, faster, cheaper. We need brain scans that are fine enough scale, cheap enough, fast enough, and we need enough models of cells. And we have those three things, then we can do this, and we need those all to be cheap enough.
Just spell them out again. There were three things.
We need lots of cheap, fast, parallel computers, because we have to emulate a whole brain cheaply.
Which
That's
are
a
not
lot.
brains, so
Right.
hardware, computers in the narrow
Yes,
sense.
exactly.
Computers in the...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Lots of hardware that can emulate brains, and it's cheap and fast enough. Second, we need high enough resolution in spatial and chemical terms of brains. That is, scans of brains. We have to see a brain in detail, a particular brain, where all the cells are, what type, connected to what.
This we can do for very primitive creatures already, right? Some kind of worms or jellyfish.
We can actually do it for, say, mice already.
Nice.
It's more about cost and resolution. So we can actually already scan pretty high resolution, but it's just very expensive at the moment. But honestly, of these three things, it's probably the thing that'll be ready first is the scans. So the third thing we need is models of the cells. And as I say, we already have decent models of many kinds of cells, but we need to have it for all of them.
So there are engineering and scientific breakthroughs that we need
Right.
to achieve, but they are some sense...
But in a sense, they're more of the same.
They are trends, directions in which we already are progressing.
Right. And they're also just the same kind of thing we've already done.
Yeah.
There's not
okay.
necessarily
Good.
new kinds of things.
So now I slowed you down for 45 minutes, just getting the basic assumptions of this book right, and now we can open it on page
All right.
1. Actually, we already dug in the middle already, because the basic scientific discipline that you do apply, economics, and the basic idea of supply and demand already destroys most of the scenario that I described, exactly for the fact that these M's are piss poor.
Right. So there's the whole world of humans, 7 billion, say, at the moment, maybe more at the time when this happens.
Fleshy humans like you
Right.
and me. Yeah.
And these biological humans, all of a sudden the emulations become possible. And now the emulations quickly are cheaper than the humans, so pretty much all the humans lose their jobs.
We assume the emulations will run, say, in the networks of Google or
Right.
in some
Just
universities.
data centers all over the place.
Yeah.
So the humans lose their jobs, but the emulations are all scans of humans. And so the emulation world will be eager for scans of the most productive humans. And so this emulation economy will select among humans for the best, at least in terms of this new world. And it will be very severe about that selection. That is, probably most M's are copies of the 1,000 most productive humans. And you could have millions and billions of copies of each one of those.
There might be very rich humans who decide to enter the M world
Right.
and can finance it themselves.
Well, actually, most humans could probably finance a couple of copies of themselves as M's, but that would still be a small fraction of all the M's. So from the point of view of the M's, most M's are copies of the few thousand most
spell this
copied
out,
humans.
because we assume there are trillions of M's
Yes.
and only billions of humans.
Right, exactly.
So even if every human was allowed to enter the M world, just to be able to
Which
play...
they probably could.
Which they could.
With a few copies, they would not be in economic demand to make millions of copies of each one of those. Whereas in the M economy, it'll be willing to make billions of copies of the productive M's, because that's the high value.
So in any case, the billions of humans, even if they were all copied, or maybe just the rich people who could afford this were copied, play basically no role in understanding the M economy.
Well, so humans start out owning all the capital in the economy. That is, they own
As we do now.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
They own all the patents and all the stock and all the real estate. And for a while, they would probably maintain that dominance on capital. So basically, the biological humans are the rich capitalists, and the M's are the proles, workers, in this scenario.
It's like the time machine. They are the Morlocks that work behind the scenes
Right.
and do all the work, and the humans enjoy life like the alloy on the surface of the planet.
Right. Except a key difference here is because the M's can run at different speeds, I figure out what the typical speed of an M is. It's about 1,000 times human speed.
That seems to be a very precise prediction. I mean, why did you say 1,000 there? So I do understand why you didn't say 100ths. Because
Right.
if the M was thinking slower than the human because of
Right.
parallel hardware, then there would be no reason for the M economy. Or
Right.
would there? Well, there would be less reason for it, right? Because then it would be better to have the fleshy, the biological human do the work than the emulated human.
So my calculation of 1,000 is based on a trade-off of two considerations, which happen to meet in the middle. One consideration is that jobs tend to change on the time scale of the doubling of the economy. That's true in our world today. Our economy doubles roughly every 15 years, and that's the time scale in which firms go bankrupt, new firms are created. If firms don't go bankrupt, the jobs are restructured and individual jobs are restructured because the economy changes a lot on this time scale of a doubling. So,
Education's become irrelevant.
right, and you have to retrain yourself, you have to reskill for a new world every 15 years.
And this is the tragedy right now for us biological
Right,
humans, because
exactly.
just a few generations ago, we died faster than the economy could double.
Right, exactly.
So the education you took was relevant for the rest of your
1,000
life.
years ago, when you trained at 20, your skills would still be available, pretty relevant at 80. Hardly anything would have changed. But today, you train at 20, and the world's very different at 80. And by the time you need to keep retraining, or else you're out of date, right? So that's a cost that the M world would be looking to avoid. And so it would probably rather that a typical M career fit within a doubling time. If it fits within a fraction of a doubling time, even better. But it starts to pay substantial costs when the M career length fits several doubling times.
Because this is so hard to understand if you have this virtual reality video game view of the M world, that the M's still have to be trained, they have to take an education,
exactly.
they have to work.
And their job skills have to continue to be relevant. So we know that people today start out young and they're plastic and they're fluid and they're flexible, and over time they become more rigid and inflexible. And that limits the feasible career length of M's.
And this might be true for M's as well, because again,
Yes.
we're making minimal assumptions
Right.
about the quality of these.
Right. And so let's just make
minds.
clear this as a summary. We didn't specify this. You might imagine that once we can make M's, now we can modify them lots of ways. We can go change everything. We can make them 100 times bigger, or combine one guy's music with another guy's athletics, etc. But we're really assuming initially that this is spaghetti code. We don't understand it very well. We can't make very many useful modifications. And so there's a limited number of things we can do to an M. We can turn it on, turn it off, erase it. We can run it fast, run it slow. We can copy it, and that's about it. And so that limits the range of things we can do to these M's. But running fast or slow is one of our key options, and we have to decide how much. Now, when we run it twice as fast, we have to pay twice as much for computer hardware to support that. So the amount of subjective time it takes to do any one task is about the same, and that's about the same cost. So if it takes you 5 minutes to do something, whether we run you fast or slow, it's still going to cost about the same to have you experience about 5 minutes and do the task.
But it's so hard to any person who is not you to get out of the intuition that hardware costs can't possibly be important here, because hardware costs today are so cheap compared to everything else. So why can these trivial constraints suddenly become the dominating economic factor in the M world?
So this is supply and demand. So at the moment, we have a limited amount of labor and a lot of things to do that are very valuable. And so we pay the marginal worker the value of their marginal work, which is a lot.
So we here educate computer scientists, so they are in high demand.
That's in part because we have a limited number of people available. In the past, when there were a lot more people, the value of the marginal task fell to a much smaller value. And there's no limit to how far it can fall if the population is arbitrarily large. If we hold constant the amount of land and machines and other things, if we had 1 trillion people on Earth at the moment and we had the same amount of everything else, the marginal person would be worth a lot less.
Right, because so let's just take the example here of this university education. Instead of educating all these people, we take just our best student, and then we take 10,000 copies of him or her.
Right, and all the rest are not so valued.
Then the rest of, and that means that nobody would finance the hardware cost, or I guess they themselves would finance the hardware cost.
They'll run out of their own financing eventually if they're not competitive.
And then they will not be able to afford the hardware upgrade or the large-scale
hardware itself. Yeah. So the key point is this is an economy where there's a lot of production to have, and it's a subsistence economy. So we know most production is targeted toward producing subsistence. There's no question about where most of the effort is going. In a subsistence economy, most of the effort is producing subsistence. That is here computer hardware, energy, cooling, communication lines, structural support, those sort of things. That's where all the resources are going because that's what it takes to subsist. And the economy is demanding those things, and if you can produce those things more cost effectively than other people, there's a big demand for you. But if you can't, you can subsidize yourself for a while on some subsidy pool, but if you run out of that pool, then you run out.
And you would downgrade yourself to run on cheaper, slower hardware somewhere else.
Right, so it's interesting to note that because cost is proportional to speed, in fact, the speeds can probably go up to 1 million times faster than human speed and down to 1 billion times slower than human speed. And all across that whole range, cost is roughly linear in speed. That means there's a huge range to go when you get poor to just go slow. So in fact, when people get poor here, they don't starve to death and die. They just get slow. They can't afford the more expensive fast hardware, and they just have to lower their clock rate, which means they experience the world around them speeding up. And
So poverty will now be slowness.
yes.
I need to cut in here because, again, I've been having this conversation many times with many annoyed lunch partners, and this and many of the other things we're going to talk about is just morally abhorrent to many people. And
Being slow?
well, conceptualizing poverty, right? Realizing that not everybody is equally qualified for jobs. All these things are seem to lead to some immediate psychological reaction in most people you talk to it about.
Yeah.
And I, and even more you, have trained ourselves to talk about these things in a way that we avoid value signaling about
We're
this.
doing a neutral analysis.
Trying to do a neutral analysis about
As a preface to our evaluation, we of course are happy to do an evaluation eventually, but we want to make sure we get the analysis right first.
But the very fact that we talk about this neutrally, in many people leads to some kind of reaction, which then leads them to reject not only the conversation, but reject the model, right?
The analysis.
And the hypothesis.
How could the analysis be right if the analyzer is so emotionally neutral?
Yes.
Surely
Very
the
good.
truth is never told by an emotionally neutral analyzer. The truth is only told by passionate advocates for moral truth.
But so this misunderstanding may also appear because futurism is some kind of genre which is normally used not so much to analyze
Yes, it's
the
used
future.
a way indirectly to preach about things. People use science fiction and futurism often as a way to preach morality indirectly about their world around them and not so much about the future. And that's a trope of science fiction and futurism that has a lot of truth to it.
And resonates a lot. So preach, is there a nicer way of putting that? So now you're moralizing about this thing, but not about the M world.
Preaching is a good thing sometimes.
Preaching is a good thing. Signaling value. So futurism normally is a genre that we use to signal values about the present rather than analyze the future.
Right. I mean, so for example, Wells' Eloy and Morlock was an obvious metaphor for the class inequality in the world that Wells saw and his readers saw.
Yes.
And readers engaged that book and liked it in part because it was preaching or moralizing or giving an allegory of their own world.
Yeah.
If a future book was actually describing a strange world that didn't have a moral resonance with your world, most readers would not find it very interesting.
Very good. Very nicely put. That being said, we want to continue actually analyzing the future in a neutral way.
Right.
And
let's make sure we get to an evaluation.
Yes.
Right.
At the end of that, it's open to everybody to evaluate this. Well, also before we go there, what we try to do in describing this future will probably look strange or alien and maybe abhorrent to somebody today in the same way, I guess, that the similar experience would be to somebody who lived in the Middle Ages or certainly in a hunter-gatherer society.
So obviously in the Middle Ages, people were used to living in a subsistence world. They were used to the idea that if you couldn't bring in enough food, you either starved or somebody supported you and had less food themselves. I think we do have an abhorrence, correctly so, for the idea of people around us starving to death.
Yeah.
We don't like that, of course. And so if we are presented with the image of our world suddenly transitioning to a world of subsistence, and suddenly many of us starving, that is an immediately horrifying image to many of us.
Yep.
I actually think the humans in this world will do okay, and we can talk about that in the sense that they will be, on average, pretty rich, and they won't be starving to death. They just won't be in the center of this new world. The M's will be, but the M's won't be starving to death. The M's will just not exist, or exist if there's a demand for them. See, and that's a subtler variation. It's not that they are created and then die of starvation because there's no demand. There's a set of initial M's, and then the M market economy is saying, which of them should we make more copies of? It's going to this person saying, that person seems to be very productive. Let's make more copies of that person. And the other person is saying, sorry, we're not interested in investing in you. That doesn't mean that person starves to death. That means that person doesn't have more copies. That person can continue in their original mode, but there's no demand for more of them.
Right.
So the M economy is making more of the ones it has a demand for, and each one of those it has a demand for, they're existing and they're being fed and they're having a meaningful life and a job. But, the economy is selecting for the ones that are productive.
Good. So this was the supply and demand view that informs us that the M's will try to price each other out of the market with whatever skill they have, And if you need a new operating system to be written, then you can just talk to the Linus Torvalds M and say, please make a million
Copy
copies
number
of this.
1,500,000, because there's a lot of them.
And then Linus, and if you have the money for it, you can speed up Linus to a 1,000 times normal speed, and then he will write a new Linux kernel for you in no time. And the coordination problem, version control will be no problem.
Exactly, and that's why the M world is so productive in part, not just because they're on computer hardware that's cheap, but because the typical emulation is of a quality similar to our Nobel Prize winners, Olympic gold medalists, billionaires, heads of state. They're that quality on average, and they know it. That's the typical emulation. It's that good at their job.
Otherwise they wouldn't have been copied.
Exactly.
Again, there might be other people. There might be people like you and me or our listeners, but they may just exist in a single copy that runs at very slow speeds and maybe just enjoys life in a virtual environment, pretending they are a dragon.
Right, so most of these are working most of the time. They are in a mode where they are working most of the hours of the week because it's a competitive world. So you and I know many people in professional lives who do similarly, right? They work a lot of hours a week because they're in a competitive world that kind of demands that.
Reading your book changed my mode of interaction with people, because sometimes I tell people that you would do very well in the M world. I just was at a party with lots of people who win competitive programming contests, for instance. They are highly focused, extremely driven workaholics.
And it's important to look at those people and say, are those lives worth living?
Yes.
Because there are drawbacks, and you and I might not want to be one of them, but I think overall I have to say their lives look like they're worth living. They are enjoying their lives, they find their lives meaningful. And so I say the M's would similarly enjoy their lives and find their lives meaning in that same way. They are working really hard, but they want to work really hard. That's what they're selected for, and they're really good at it. And that's the kind of creature that they are.
And this is maybe the strongest. This is the psychology part. That's the area where my initial prediction is the most wrong. Because if you just think about living in virtual reality, I think the immediate idea would be that people would be really happy and lazy, and the difficulty would be to find meaning. But the opposite is true.
Right. Now, there's this generic fact that almost everybody presented with any strange world wonders how those people find meaning. So just in general, each of us does find meaning in our world typically, but if we are presented with any world of people far away in the world or back in history or some strange future, most people just say, well, how do those people find meaning? Because we mostly can't imagine finding meaning in a world that isn't our world. But in fact, most people in history have found meaning in their world,
or didn't have the money to ask the question. I guess most people in the Middle Ages didn't really think about this.
But I think they had meaning.
They had meaning. Oh yes.
They just didn't think about the question of whether they had meaning.
They were not sure whether they were happy. I guess that's a question they didn't find as interesting.
They didn't find that as interesting, actually. And that's true. But they definitely found meaning in their life. And I sort of think the M's will find meaning, and you could also ask whether they'll be as happy, in the sense of maybe they won't ask that question either.
But they are probably workaholics. I mean, the workaholics I know seem to be quite content with working.
Well, they find meaning in it. They grouse about it sometimes, and sometimes they seem to be a little stressed, a little anxious, but overall I'd say their lives have meaning.
So can we quickly describe work life? So most jobs would be office jobs.
Most jobs are office jobs. They might as well sit in a virtual reality office. Because it's cheap, and then they have breaks. So we have a huge literature on breaks at work for humans, and we see that it's important for people to have a break once an hour, a break several times a day, a break in the evening, a break on the weekends, vacations periodically per year.
And
those are important.
And when you
for
say
people.
Important, because you're either economist, you mean for productivity.
For productivity,
yes.
It's important, and it's important that you not work too many hours a week. In fact, we have data for most workers that working, say, 60 hours a week makes you less productive over an extended period than working less. And so M's would therefore work as many hours a week as is maximally productive, which is a lot less than the maximum. And similarly, they'd have breaks all the time.
And they would have corner offices, because that's another commodity.
Right,
everybody
cheap.
would have a nice office with a breathtaking, but not too distracting view.
Right, not too distracting, but just nice enough to be comfortable in.
Yeah.
I also actually calculate the productivity difference between the best M and the second best M, because that tells you how much slack the best guy has to be not quite maximally productive.
Would they want that?
Well, they would have the option.
Okay.
The key thing is, because you wonder if there's such an intense competition, maybe you're pushed right to the edge and there's no margin at all to be even slightly lazy. But I can say, no, the best person has the margin of being better than the second best person. And we can actually calculate the typical log normal distribution of ability and calculate the typical difference between the best and the second best. And I say...
Yeah, I guess there you're sort of losing me because I'm not an economist, right? So these parts seem to be...
Okay, but I can just tell you, they have a slack of about 6%.
6%.
They can waste 6% of their day and still be okay.
Yeah, but this seems to be dressing up a highly contingent scenario in quantitative terms that's where
I think it's a robust number, but
you think it's a robust
we'd
number?
have to go into the details. Now, as long as we're talking about things that bother people, another variation is typically, say you start a work day, you're refreshed, you rested all night, you're productive for 8, maybe 12 hours, and then you need to rest again, right?
I still need more detail here. I wake up, my virtual mind has enjoyed some kind of sleep,
right?
Which, since it's just a simulation
not just
of
sleep, other kinds of rest. You watch TV, you chatted with friends, you just backed off and relaxed a bit. Most of us need that.
Because the simulated mind is just a simulation of a human brain that likes these kinds of things. So
it needs them.
We assume that it needs that as well.
For productivity, it needs them. And so M's will take a break in the evening, chat a bit, socialize, watch TV, sleep.
I wake up intellectually rested.
Ready for the day.
I may have some kind of fake breakfast experience or not, who knows.
Right, or fake conversation, water cooler chat, whatever it takes to get you ready for the day.
Because my M does not need food or coffee.
No, but it might need the ritual of food.
It might need the ritual of food.
Right.
And then I will teleport to my office.
Right, and then you're ready to be productive for 8 to 12 hours, after which you'll need to rest again. Now, so that's the ratio of the 24 hours is a factor of 2 or 3 that you have to pay extra for rest. Now, if you make several copies at the beginning of the workday,
of myself?
Yes, and have them all work during the workday, and have at the end of the workday end all but one, and have only one go on to the next day.
So yeah, thank you for taking this up, because this is the one that my daughters are most bothered by.
Right. Okay.
Because this is the scenario I tell them, and
yes.
I use a specific terrible task, namely grading exams. The worst thing I know in my professional life.
So you make a copy to grade exams.
I think this sounds great. Let's just spell it out. Twice a year, I have to grade 200 exams. It's the worst part of my work life I know. So at 1 o'clock. Some Thursday afternoon, I might just make 200 copies of myself. Each of them grades one exam that takes 15 minutes.
And it's then done.
And then the exams are graded. And now the terrible thing happens.
Well, is it terrible is the question we're going to now ask.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, remember, it's very cheap to make things slow. So in principle, each of these 50-minute tasks could be slowed down by a factor of 1 billion, and all the copies could be saved. Except, why bother? Because now they'll experience the world going 1 billion times slower, and that's not very interesting life, perhaps. Or we might just erase those copies. Now, so there's a trade-off here on several margins. First of all, on the gain, this is a factor of 2 or 3 more productive. Remember, we don't have to spend the other rest of the day resting up. This is full work.
Oh, for me it's even better because I don't have to grade 200 exams. I find this annoying. And, the one surviving copy of me
doesn't remember doing it.
Can we give me numbers? So there's TOR 1 and there's TOR 2 up to TOR 200.
Right.
In parallel, those 200 copies will grade one exam each.
Right. And they will each dislike grading just like you do.
Yes.
But then they'll be over. But you won't remember those things. Now, so from the point of view of pleasant memory, there's a gain here, is that you don't have to remember the unpleasant task of grading.
I remember grading one of them, and then I collect. So TOR 1, who...
Right. Now, there's disadvantages here. One disadvantage is, to get good at a job, you need to have remembered doing it. So you'll need to remember doing a lot of unpleasant things just to have gotten good enough at them so that now you can do them well.
That makes sense for research, right? The other unpleasant part of my work is spending 200 hours thinking about problems and none of them work.
But this is all important. Have experience grading to get good at grading. So there'll have been some part of your life that you remember getting good at grading. That'll be part of your memory. But then after that, you can be passed.
I'm past 50, no professor increases in
right.
grading.
At that point, you're done
50,
at grading. You don't need to remember those, right? So, but that's a trade-off. To the extent you need to remember, you need to learn from doing a job, you'll have to remember the experience of doing a job. Now, I make the analogy of a party today, where if you took a drug at the beginning of a party, where it means you won't remember that party the next day or ever after. So imagine you take this
drug could be alcohol,
for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
In sufficient quantities.
Yes. Oh, we're in Scandinavia, so
right. Okay. So the key point is, now you are in this mode of a person at a party knowing that you won't remember this party tomorrow or the next day. That's who you are at this party. You are a creature who won't be remembered. Now, toward the end of this party, you could say to yourself, I'm about to die. That person tomorrow, that's not me, because he won't remember these things, thoughts I'm having right now, these feelings I'm having right now. He can't identify with me right now. He's not me. You could take that attitude, or you could take the attitude that I will go on.
I'm not really dying. I'm just being replaced by the save point at 6 o'clock when I took the drug.
I will go on. I just won't remember this part of what I did.
Right.
Because we're already used to there's parts of our past we don't remember.
Right.
We don't remember everything that happened in our childhood, but we still think of that as me. I was still the child, even if I don't remember all of that, right? So that's another attitude we have. We have these two available attitudes about the end of party me. I'm a new creature about to die, I hate this. Or I will continue on, I just won't remember everything. That was a choice I made. I don't need to remember everything. So M's who make these short-term copies, who do the 15 minutes of grading, they have these same two choices. They could say, I'm a new creature, was created with a 15-minute life, with a crappy job, no leisure, I hate this. How did I get myself into this? Or they could say, I will go on, I just won't remember this unpleasant thing that I didn't want to remember.
And know that the original Tour 1 will actually
continue on and
paid
be fine
for this and have nice memories,
right?
Not including grading this damn exam.
I mean, so already today you should ask yourself, if it's the middle of the workday and you're working, why are you working for that guy later today who gets to enjoy leisure? I mean, he's not you, is he? I mean, he's some other guy. You're working now for that other guy, and he's taking advantage of you. Why let him take advantage of you? Why not rebel and say, I deserve leisure right now. I should get to walk out of the office and go stand in the park because I'm me now and I should get to enjoy my life. Why should I work today for that guy later today? But of course, we don't say that because we identify with this other person later today as ourselves.
Yes. Oh, yeah. And the copies will identify strongly with the original because much stronger than
twins.
twins.
That's a choice they have. Now, the claim is they will typically make the choice to identify. And I make that claim on the mere basis that helps them get along in this world. Clearly, when they don't get along, there's a lot of conflict, and it's much harder for them to be productive.
Right, because you describe these two mindsets we can have with respect to copying and then ending.
Right.
And one of the mindsets would be highly adaptive in the M world.
Exactly. It helps you get along and work and do things, and the other one is much harder to manage.
And the other mindset would not.
And so this competitive world selects for the get along attitude.
Again, so this is not a question about whether the M world is for everybody. It's certainly not for everybody, but it's for people with a very specific work attitude. They have to like working, they have to be...
But notice that your world is like this too, and most worlds humans have ever lived in. That is, we are living in a different work world than our ancestors lived in, and most of our ancestors wouldn't like some key aspects of our work world.
And they wouldn't understand why we work at all, for instance.
Well, not only why we work, but why we put up with so much domination and ordering and ranking. Most of our ancestors wouldn't have put up with the level of that we put up with. They would, as a matter of pride, think that was just beneath them to put up with the level of that we put up with in our world. But we have adapted to this world.
Can we insert the Hansonian forager-farmer dichotomy here? So this is something that you're also mildly famous for.
My one-factor model of history over the last 100,000 years is that we were once foragers, and as foragers, we lived in harmony with nature. That is, when we did what felt natural, it was roughly the right thing to do.
Harmony with nature means getting killed in entertaining ways.
But it still meant when we followed our instincts, it was roughly the right thing. We didn't need to overcome our interests with very much conscious thought.
Oh, I see, because our psychology has evolved to exactly that kind of adaptive environment.
Our instincts were roughly matched to our environment, and so things just worked.
This is the time of hunter-gatherers, up to 30,000, maybe even
10,000 years ago, in that range, right? Okay. But we were culturally plastic, and that allowed us to change our values and our behaviors and move to a wide range of environments, and it particularly allowed us to become farmers. So once farming was possible, the optimal behavior as farmers was really quite different from foragers. Farmers have to put up with war and domination and ranking, slavery, being cruel to animals, not having much travel, not having as much leisure, less variety of behavior, less art.
And see, now this sounds terrible to anybody who lives in a forager world. If I told somebody...
So foragers didn't like the farming life, and they often resisted for quite a long time before being forced to adopt a farming life, often due to competitive pressures from neighbors who had adopted farming and then were pressing in on them. So farmers lived less long, they had less nutritional variety, they had more disease. They had less free time. It was, in many ways, a worse life.
How could we? Yeah.
Right? So why would they choose that?
Yeah,
Of course,
yeah.
nobody had a committee meeting to decide this.
Right.
It was just a local choice each local group made, and they made it in competitive pressures, and that was just that affected choices.
And you can tie this to psychology, even to political allegiance, right? You have this idea that one of these worlds is much more conservative than the other, and surprisingly...
Well, right. So the story here is that humans develop cultural pressures to make themselves be farmers. More conformity pressures, later religious pressures, lots of self-control. Farmers are really proud of their self-control, and they need self-control in order to make themselves act in ways that are different from what's natural to foragers.
Because you have to plant and wait and wait and
Well,
wait.
not only have to plant, you have to resist the temptation to be lazier, to run away from a battlefield,
Right.
to say F you to your king. These are all things that foragers would be tempted to do that a farmer shouldn't do, and farmers have social pressures to get them to act in the new farmer ways. And we succeeded in creating enough cultural pressures to make people act like farmers.
Or we selected
Right?
for people who...
Exactly. And then in the last few hundred years, we've had this getting rich thing. And the key point is that...
Oh, so it's forager, farming, industrial revolution.
But industrials are foragers in many ways, is the key point. So the thing that made us farmers in one way was poverty. So take the example of a young woman thinking of having a child out of wedlock, a love child. Now, for a forager, that was just a really common thing. It's not a problem, okay? The groups would take care of it, etc. It just happened. Now, for a farmer, the culture said, no. If you have a child out of wedlock, and we see that, you and your child may die. And this wasn't an idle threat. They would see examples of this sort of thing around them to remind them that this was not an idle threat.
And there would
that
be
would scare
religious,
them.
there would be religious institutions that enforce these use points.
Right, it was enforced in part through poverty, through the fact that other people would shame you and run away from you, etc. The threat that you would die was a real threat if you violated the religious cultural rules of the society around you.
But not because you were killed by a priest, but because you starved.
Right, because people wouldn't marry you, wouldn't do business with you, etc. And so kick you out of the town, whatever it is, right? So, but in our world today, when same religious groups or cultures say don't have a child out of wedlock, the young woman looks around her and says, I see other women, and they have children out of wedlock, and they seem to be doing okay, and I want to do that. And so that cultural pressure is just much less threatening or credible. And so today, when we're rich, we more look inside ourselves and say, what do I want? And we're rich enough to just do it often, and that's the drifting back to forager attitudes as we've gotten rich. And so I claim this explains most of the major cultural trends in the last few hundred years. Pro-democracy, lower fertility, lower religion, more travel, more leisure, more art.
Focus on inequality or
Less
inequality.
slavery,
Less slavery.
more concern about inequality, more product variety and concerns about that, individual expressive signaling. Most of these major trends are understood as going back to being like foragers. Except at work. Now, work attitudes and behaviors are just a separate category. It's the goose that lays the golden egg, and we don't mess with that so much. So we're kind of schizoid. At work, we're kind of hyper farmers, but outside of work, we've gone back to being
Certainly
foragers.
in some jobs we are farmers, and in our leisure time we are foragers. And then to get this back to the M economy, then we are back at a Malthusian dystopia.
So many people looking at the future in that initial story you told like to imagine a future like Star Trek or the culture world where we get rich and richer and we have more and more free time and more freedom and more self-expression and focus on what we enjoy. And that's a science fiction future many people like to think about.
I do.
And it is a straightforward projection of recent trends over the last few centuries. But there's no guarantee that actually continues that trend in that direction. So the age of M is a concrete scenario where that trend is reversed. The M's themselves are now poor again, and they're no longer forager attitude style creatures. They revert to something more like a farmer style in the sense that they have strong cultural pressures to get them to act in the ways that is appropriate for their world.
Can you list the sort of median psychological profile of the M? It's hardworking, honest,
workaholic, loyal to their clan and to their community, respectful of work and somewhat disrespectful of lazy, and they are proud of their achievement at work. They get a lot more meaning out of work than the typical person today.
conservative.
And so they are going to be religious. Probably.
Religious. Mm-hmm.
That is, religion is functional in our society in helping people commit themselves to patterns of behavior that didn't feel natural to foragers, to make them feel part of a community, that get that community support for those behaviors.
Okay, right. So just to tie this back to the thing that my daughters are worried about, it would be easy for them to invent a religion where it would be religiously adaptive to end after grading exams. There could be an entire ritual tied to that, and that religion would help you with this a priori different psychological process.
A bunch of standard things you're supposed to do, and maybe at the moment you're supposed to do it, you feel a little queasy about it, but then your shame of betraying your community or religion would push you to go through with it. In the same way that a soldier who was religious might committed to fighting the battle when at the moment they wanted to run away. They would, instead of running away, they would be ashamed of running away, wanting to run away, and all the more determined to march into the battle.
So it seems Ems would have pretty good, pretty precise impression of themselves as well, because
they would know themselves.
They would.
That's
what I want to say, right? Because for instance, one of the reasons why I don't think I would have a chance in the M economy is that I know that if I farmed out some task to a copy of myself, then the copy of myself would never actually get this done,
so
because,
many people think about
I don't trust myself.
Ems would very quickly find out what happens when they assign a copy to do something, and then they are the copy assigned to do it, and do I do it?
Yeah.
And whatever, and if they find that a certain package of an assignment doesn't work, as they don't actually do it, they will search in the space of packages that work, and they will find whatever works as a package of, okay, you do this, and then you get this much leisure, and that's the package. Are you okay with that? And they find whatever package works. So they would quickly find whatever works, but the ones whose packages that work are more productive will win in the competition among Ems for being the most productive Ems. So Ems won't have children initially in the way we have children, in the sense of a mother and a father producing a combination of the two of them. They will mostly reproduce by making copies, but because they have a limited career length, they need to keep restarting earlier copies and raising them as children to be trained and then become a worker adult. So now what you have is you raising younger versions of yourself and having older versions of yourself around.
So there's some kind of computer fridge where there's a 13-year-old version of me.
Or 5-year-old.
Or a 5-year-old version of me.
Right,
and
waiting around to be restarted. So
there's possibly entire psychological institutes devoted to studying
you,
5-year-old me.
Right.
Oh, right. That makes sense, because there are, if I'm successful, millions of me.
Right. So you may well get married, but when you think about marrying Susan, or I don't know who your wife's name is, you will know that you will have seen millions of other marriages between you and Susan, and have a lot of statistics on how well that goes.
There are TV shows about that.
Right. You will not be blindsided about how your marriage will go. Whatever main options you have, they will have been tried many times over and over again, and you will roughly know how they play out.
There will be literature about that,
right.
TV
so
shows
you'll
about
know
that.
What happens when you try to be an actor, what happens when you try to be an athlete, what happens when you try to be a computer programmer. You will have seen your versions of yourself try those things, and you'll have a rough idea how that plays out. Those won't be mysteries. And then you will have a child's version of yourself to help raise, and you will know all the different attempts that older versions of yourself have to raise younger versions of yourself.
Makes no sense.
What strategies they've tried and what's worked. You will be part of, it's like being part of a franchise like McDonald's or something, right? You're not all on your own inventing what the dishes should be and how to run it. You've got this whole franchise there to help you work this place out.
Not only are there millions of copies of a successful M, like let's just pretend that I am a successful M, there would be millions of copies of me, there would be millions of copies that have branched off from me at various points. So there will be...
try different things, and you'll see all that statistics.
Some of them will have my education, others won't. There will be maybe some of them that actually manage to play blues guitar really well, and they will be successful.
Now, to complicate this a little, what will actually happen is they will copy teams. So today, we aren't so much productive as individuals, we're productive as parts of teams. Now that's a problem in our society because teams come and go and reformed, and so our individual productivity actually varies a lot in unpredictable ways because our teams vary. We might know that you got great grades in school, etc., but we don't know when we put you on this team at our firm how well you work on that team.
Oh, but it turns out that I, in connection with Bob and Susan,
make a good team. The M world will just copy that whole team.
A million times.
Yes. And so what will more often be copied in the M world is whole teams that work well together. And then you might take younger versions of those whole teams and train them up together to become teams together, and you'll have that whole experience. And so instead of you being a unit made as copies, they'll be the teams made as copies.
And we all have the same friends, or versions of the same friends. Every tour will know a Susan and a Bob.
Right.
And we will meet after work on Friday
So
night.
when you and your teammates interact, you'll know in the background that there's 1,000 or 1,000,000 other copies of that team out there, and they're looking at statistics of all the teams. So if you do something really weird in this team, that will have an impact on all the other copies of your team. If you just throw a hissy fit, not only will these people think a little less of you, all the other copies of you, and that'll restrain you a little bit. You will feel a little conformity pressure. No, you don't want to do that to all of your other teammates.
Because I'm responsible to many copies of myself and their status.
Exactly. Anything you do will be reflected in all the rest of them.
So you've obsessed about these kinds of questions many years. When you find this new interesting detail, which must have been new to you as well when you started thinking about this.
Exactly.
What do you do to sort of learn about this? Sit down and think?
Well, so I had a book whose scope was a whole civilization. And I had thought about some parts of the civilization, and I had written sections on that. And then I looked and I said, well, what's missing here? And I said, oh, well, say there's no labor economics, or there's no cultural economics, or there's no mating. And I said, I need to have a section on that. And I said, well, what do I know about that? And so the first thing is to go read up the basics of that, if I don't know it, in order to have the basic theory of how that thing works, and then I have to try to apply it. So I just did this exercise of continuing going to a new area that I hadn't covered and saying, what's the basic we know about this area? And now, what is the most basic things we know about that predict for this world? I just iterate that until I ran out of time.
Yeah. So it's also an opportunity to familiarize yourself with many.
If you're going to describe a whole civilization, you'll need to know about a lot of aspects of a civilization.
You need the introductory course to many disciplines.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's a nice. I mean, if you happen to be a polymath type who finds it hard to focus, and the world doesn't reward that typically, this is a way to get more of a reward from that, because you can't do this sort of task unless you actually know a lot about a lot of different areas.
Even for a reader is good. Like me, I also have difficulty focusing, but getting this sort of first approximation on this civilization from many different perspectives is just highly instructive, highly informative.
Right, so the basic structure in each thing, say mating, is to say, well, what's my theory of mating in our world? What's my general theory of mating that applies to all the different worlds we've ever seen? And now what does that theory apply? What does it say about this new world when applied?
So yeah, let's go there. This is so it's virtual reality. Everybody looks like Brad Pitt or Wonder Woman.
Right, so for mating, physical appearance is easy to achieve. Everybody's beautiful.
Everybody's beautiful.
Everybody
if they want.
Looks beautiful, feels beautiful, sounds beautiful. It's all great, right? Now, of course, people are picky. So being physically beautiful won't be enough because that's too easy to get.
That's
right?
the baseline.
Right. And so you'll ask, well, what will they be picky about? What will be hard to get? And so, of course, now your mind isn't easy to make beautiful in the sense of being articulate or witty or clever. And so there'll be a premium on that. And so it will be hard to be as clever or witty or charismatic or charming as everybody else. And that will be a difference that they will notice and see between each other. I mean, they'll try to have automated aids to make them clever and charming, but they won't work as well for some as others. And so they will be those differences. And then we already just have a lot of standard data about across all the history of civilizations we've ever seen, what people tend to prefer in mates. And so there's just a rough summary that I found in the literature and I drew on. So I said, well, apparently men have a preference for women who give signs of fertility, and that has to do with signs of youth, signs of compassion and empathy toward children, which are similarly empathy toward other things, and of course all the other signs of intelligence and strength, etc. But
so fertility doesn't make sense here because we can't have reproductive sex in the end world, but my psychology doesn't know that. Okay, very good.
Right.
And the second part, youth and beauty.
So youth is a sign of fertility.
Fine.
And so
I assume they're virtual avatars to be beautiful, healthy.
Right, but there are psychological signs of fertility. So we often find attractive a youthful spontaneity and playfulness that we might not see in an older personality, and men find that attractive in women as a sign of youth, which is a sign of fertility. And similarly, in the literature, it says that women are especially interested in signs of status and resources in the men. They want not just any man, but a man who's respected by others, liked by others, a man who is powerful, other signs of status, and those are also things I would predict here. Those are just, of course, everybody likes all those things. It's just a matter of emphasis. And so...
And they could all be wrong, but historically
right.
they seem
but
to be not
the
wrong.
easy thing to do is, again, this is just my generic method. I don't have the resources to question every literature. The first status is just go read the literature and say, what's their standard conclusion, and then just apply it. I would have to have a strong reason to question a literature to do anything else. So,
unless you were more interested in signaling about the...
For example, right.
About the present than predicting the future.
Right, so that's my weak prediction here. Now, I mean, there's an interesting question about sexuality, which is somewhat different than attraction. So pair bonding is pretty robust. That is, people do like over a lifetime to have pair bonds, friends.
Serial pair bonds.
Right, it doesn't have to be monogamy for life, but almost all of our ancestors had pair bonds, at least that lasted for several years. And so that's a robust thing to predict. I could predict pair bonds. Sexuality is somewhat different in the sense that we have seen places where sex is more versus less important. And sex has been varied a lot across cultures. But I got to predict there'll be some demand for sex. There's an open question how closely that would be tied to the pair bonds. But there's also, say, the possibility perhaps of some drugs that suppress sexuality. So, for example, we have the history of eunuchs, and we can say, what do eunuchs tell us about the possibility that M's could be less sexual? Because you might say, hey, sex takes a lot of time and energy, distracts you from work. If there's a way to turn a knob to make you less sexual, maybe the M world would do that.
Because there are examples like eunuchs where we actually have done this, where societies have chosen this.
And so eunuchs are famously less sexual, but they're not zero. So actually, eunuchs are actually pretty sexual. So that, I think, sets a bound saying the M's are going to be pretty sexual, even if they use drugs
they didn't
like the eunuchs.
I see.
But eunuchs were actually had a lot of sex. So honestly, that tells you the M's will too.
Yeah.
Right. But the point is, it's deeply embedded in our psychology and our habits. So I got to think the M's will do it. Now, one interesting question about sexuality, especially in the M world, is that biology so far in history has guaranteed a near equal number of men and women. And most people, though not all, are looking for sex with an opposite, male-female partner. But the M world is not guaranteed at all to produce an equal number of men and women. So that creates a novel problem for the M world. I don't know which direction it will go. It might be more men than women or more women than men. I can see arguments either way. But it's very unlikely to be very exactly evenly divided. It might be a ratio of 4-to-1 or 20-to-1.
Okay, okay. Because so even though we can't really see which psychological profile will be most adaptive, and
well, it's likely one of them will be.
But one of them probably will be, because the other thing would be a very strange
coincidence, right? That they happen to be exactly right. So that means, like, what happens when there's a ratio of 4-to-1 or 20-to-1 across genders? How do they have pair bonds across genders? So either they become asexual, or they become homosexual, or they have to find, or they become, say, polygamous or polygamous, or they have some other clever options. So one clever option is a fast-slow pair bond, where they run at different speeds.
Oh, to ameliorate the difference in frequency. Okay.
Exactly. So for example, you could have a 4-to-1 pair bond, where if you and I are partners, I see you once a day and you see me 4 times a day.
Oh, but this is even fictionalized in a recent movie, right? Where there is a virtual partner, I think, in a phone. Is it called Her?
Yes, the movie was Her.
And
she has many partners.
She has 20,000 partners.
Right, or something like that. Yes. Right. So, I mean, this is kind of interesting. But so if we have this 4-to-1 ratio, what will happen now that you see me 4 times a day, but now over my lifetime, you will have 4 people of me over your lifetime, you see. And so I might feel odd about the fact that I am devoted to you 4 times as much as you're devoted to me. And so, these are interesting.
Yeah, these are interesting, yes.
But I mean, so these are the kind of details that you get to try to think this through. So you start with the general idea, they probably want pair bonds, they probably want male-female sexual partners mostly, but how do they accommodate these things that are getting in the way?
And navigating these things, of course, and sort of encourages you to step across some cultural or political taboos, and this is a difficult exercise, I guess.
Right, well, so certainly...
To deprogram yourself from the expectations of your audience.
So this is part of futurism as wishful thinking, in a sense, or futurism as projecting our values.
Okay.
Many people have seen the change in behavior over the last few centuries as a moral discovery. wherein we've discovered that our ways are better than the past, and they hope to see a future where those trends continue. And this book is in part saying, well, many of the choices that we make different from our ancestors are less due to moral discovery than our having a different context from them. So if the future context is different, our descendants may not continue with our moral trends. They may go a different direction. So, for example, many people are happy and eager that we are having weaker gender roles, although stronger gender personalities actually, and that we are allowing more freedom and range of gender relationships.
And most of us would view that as moral progress of the highest
Moral
order.
progress and a discovery that we want or expect to be permanent.
Right.
But it need not be permanent. And it need not be permanent because of evil. It could be, impermanent because instead of moral progress, other factors are more causing these changes, and those factors can switch.
Let me. So these were a few of these very, very detailed, very fine-grained analysis of surprising aspects of this world, where you can make, I think, surprising and somewhat worrying predictions about what might happen, or what could plausibly happen, or what would be the logical conclusion of everything we know today.
Right.
The most entertaining part is, I think, the chapter on jokes, and that seems to be sort of the
jokes or swearing, perhaps.
Jokes and swearing. Yeah. What kind of? So the jokes will be that since everybody works with Susan at work, there will be jokes about Susans, and everybody will know a Susan joke, and will be largely correct.
So today, say an ethnicity is often a unit of a personality style, and we could have, in a story, there might be an Italian, say,
an Italian,
and a German,
and
then
Jew,
they would have representative personalities from those types. And a joke might have Italian or German, and because again, they're representatives. And now in this world, these individual people become these iconic representatives. So, and just as today, a joke or a story about an Italian or German might be somewhat political, and they might be taking a stance whether Italians are good or bad, or whether it's pro or con. Here, a joke or story about Sally would be somewhat political, and it's a stance about whether we like Sally.
How many Sallys does it take to screw in a light bulb?
Exactly. Yeah. Right. And so now, stories don't have these neutral characters who are apolitical anymore. That is, every story is a story of someone who is important politically, that has a iconic meaning in this culture. You can go out of your way to have unknown characters in stories, but those will be unusual characters, because most stories that are about usual circumstances will be things about the usual characters. And in fact, this is related to sort of work specialization. In the modern world, we tend to create a professional persona that is different from the personality of the person who inhabits that persona. The generic lawyer, generic dentist.
Oh, I see.
Right? And so, say for an entertainer, often an entertainer now in the modern world has a very distinctive persona, and that's an important part of being that persona, but most professions aren't like that. Right? You don't recommend that someone go see the funny dentist.
Nope.
Right? Or the dentist who tells that kind of joke, because there aren't that kind. Unless you know a particular person, you recommend dentists in general or some other kind of business, right? But in the age of M, when you say hire someone, you're less looking for a person who can fit the standard persona and therefore fit the standard job slot available for that person. You're instead going to hire a person who's very distinctive, who you can fill all the jobs like that with people like that. And so now people looking to be hired in jobs are looking to be distinctive personas, and they are being full personalities with lots of richness and detail that don't just fit into a professional persona, because they are showing themselves to be the rich, detailed person that they are, because that's the thing people know and are demanding. So, a company, all of the janitors could be Joe, and Joe is a certain style of janitor, and that's the kind of janitor we want at this company. He's not just a generic janitor like today who acts like a generic janitor, who walks down the hall and acts professional and as if his personality didn't have much to do with his job. Here, Joe is a particular kind of janitor. He has a style, and that's why we hired Joe.
And we all know Joe, and we all know a Joe joke.
Right. And we all like Joe in some ways. We have some ways to tease Joe.
He would have been selected for being really good at his job as well.
Of course. But also having a style that fit with some of the other people at the office.
So the M world is quite conflict-free. Everybody.
Well, it has conflicts that we want.
It has conflicts that we want.
You
Yes.
know, if Fred and Joe tend to have a little antagonism a bit, and they're always like competing against each other, maybe we want that on our team. Maybe we like the way the dynamic of Fred and Joe having this competition. They have a rivalry going, but that works for the office.
But otherwise, they would be reasonably content. Let's get back to swearing. What would be the worst thing you could be in the M world?
Well, so swearing is something that humans have done for a long time. It doesn't show up in our historical depictions of the ancients so much, but they did a lot of swearing.
Oh, it does, doesn't it?
Not
in literature, at least.
Right, but not in costume dramas, perhaps.
Not in costume dramas. Well, it's certainly in Shakespeare, but that's not ancient.
Right,
yeah.
exactly. So in the modern world, we have taken on this persona that we don't like swearing and that we are too polite and civilized for that.
Some of us.
Right. And so swearing is something that's on the margins and disapproved of somewhat. But in fact, swearing is typically a very functional thing for work groups that are on the edge of collapsing or not being, being able to handle their tasks. So today, people in restaurants, people on movie crews, military groups, when there's a group of people who have to really work closely together and are often at the edge of being able to handle things, they are psychologically at the edge of what they can handle, swearing is really quite functional because it lets you read other people's how close to the edge are they, how well are they handling this, right? In ways that you can't really read if they're being very polite. And so in most work groups in history who are near the edge of collapsing or falling apart, swearing is a big part of what they do because it's a way of not only showing where you are, but probing other people for where they are in terms of, can you handle this? Are you tough enough? Are you managing this? Like in many in many sort of old working class groups, you picked a nickname for each person, which was their most visible embarrassing fault, right?
Tall Sally.
Stick was the fat guy, right, etc. And you constantly reminded them that we know about your weakness. You're still one of us, but we're still going to press you on this weakness to see how sensitive you are about it, to see if you can still handle things here, right? And so I can easily predict that since M's are much more commonly near the edge of handling their tasks and the edge of collapsing or breaking apart, they are going to need this tool of swearing to manage their emotional coherence in the same way that work groups all through history have. And that they will swear, therefore. Because that's functional. But again, so the key idea here is to say, well, what's swearing for? Where is its functionality? Where does it come from? What has created swearing? And then use a theory of that to predict, will this swearing become more or less in the same world?
So now we were really, really close at these individual M's. Let's zoom out and just maybe end with describing how these worlds look physically from the outside, because there are some, I think, not so obvious but very plausible descriptions about how the M cities look, for instance.
Right. So the main thing is that we today gain from joining cities, like we're in a city right now, but we aren't all in one big city on the Earth.
But it's getting that close.
We're not there. We're certainly not moving as fast as we could.
Nope.
The main explanation is that travel congestion costs increase with city size. In larger cities, people spend a larger fraction of their time traveling.
Los Angeles would be the perfect example.
Okay, now the M's, they also gain by being close to each other in cities.
Why? This is
a
again
standard economics concept that the more other people you can easily interact with, the more you can specialize and the more options you have of who to interact with.
But Robin, we're all in virtual reality. It doesn't make a difference whether the container housing my computer is in Portugal or
on the Earth today, if you have a good enough connection, you can have a virtual reality interaction with anybody in the Earth and not know where they are.
Via Skype,
right, for example. But that's because of the speed we're at. When M's run at 1,000 times human speed, they need to be a lot closer to each other before the speed of light becomes a limit. So in fact, they need to be within 100 kilometers of each other, say. If they're farther away from that, they will notice the delay by noticing how far away somebody is.
And the delay in a conversation will be slightly maladaptive,
which will make it less natural and comfortable. So they want to be close enough to each other so that they can have an interaction without noticing how far away the other person is. And that sets a typical city-size scale of, say, 100 kilometers if they are interacting at if their speed is 1,000 times human speed. Okay. And so now within the city, you might imagine them all congregating into the same city, be really fixed, except they might, if they actually had to move their brains around within the city, that would be a problem, but they don't have to move their brains around. So they can have much bigger, denser cities than we can, you see. So they can't be spread all across the Earth, but they could be in a big clump, pretty close to each other, and then interact a lot. And so their cities can just be bigger. They could be in one or a few main cities, leaving most of the rest of the Earth for the biological humans, because the M's don't want it, for at least a while.
And the cities would be where? In Silicon Valley or in Los Angeles?
So the cities would, so cities tend to be hard to move.
Right.
So there's a number of ways to predict where cities would be. One of the factors is they will be where they started, which would probably be in a big data center near the major customers that they'll be initially interacting with. So the first M's will be serving humans in the richest parts of the world. So that could be Norway or northern China, et cetera, where they're near other concentrations that they're serving.
The M city is not in Silicon Valley, even though the engineers building the M's may be in Silicon Valley, but the data center hosting the M's will be in Norway.
So the M city starts from the data centers. It has to be the data centers that are close to where the customers are initially, because that's easiest to serve, but also has to be where it's cheap to make a data center. Now, right in the middle of an existing human city is kind of hard to make a data center. So they'll probably be near existing concentrations of humans, but maybe not right in the middle, unless they can just take over and buy a whole human city, and that depends on whether how feasible that is.
Fine, but they could buy Iceland, and then they would have cool and energy.
And so another consideration is they would like cheaper cooling, and so the more they can be near lots of cold ice water, say, the more they could have cheaper cooling. They might also do air cooling, but again, cooling is helpful. In part, it's one of many considerations. They'll also want to be near lots of raw materials. It'll actually be prohibitive to ship raw materials all across the Earth. So they'll basically make everything locally.
Yeah, not Iceland.
Well, I don't know. They'll need to be near whatever minerals and other things they would, oil that they'll need to build everything out of, because almost all manufacturing will be local.
So we have few, maybe dozens,
maybe less,
highly concentrated M data centers / cities near cold areas, but
and
also
and minerals, and each other. So it might be like there's a few of them that are pretty close to each other because they really value being close to each other.
There may be an isolated 5 isolated M cities in Canada, and there may be 5 M cities in Scandinavia.
So now, because there's so few cities, nations and cities merge. They are nation states. And
each city is a nation state because they communicate. They prefer to communicate with each other because of this boring speed of light.
And each clan that's in high demand will probably be in multiple cities.
Did we explain clan? We did not explain clan.
Okay. Well, clan would be the name for all the copies of the same original human.
So all the Robins.
Right. All the Joes, etc. So they form a clan. They have a strong bond with each other. They trust each other. They understand each other well.
They will be more like families than families are because
they're even more like each other than identical twins are.
Fine. So they will be highly nepotistic, tribal.
Right, and they may be very egalitarian internally, share a lot of resources. But
all the Joes will make sure that none of the Joes is really poor.
Or really badly treated.
So within a clan, people will be very equal and take care of each other and like each other.
So different people will have different clan styles, and that'll be one of the issues. So some people might not mind inequality within themselves, others will, and there will just be different governance styles. Joe clan will be governed by a Joe, and they'll be governed in the style Joes like, and some of them might be democracies, some will be monarchies.
And the Joe clan may be universally much poorer than the Robin clan.
Right, it's because that's just their style. But
most likely, if
Joes are in great demand, they'll probably need to be in demand in all the cities.
Oh, there are Joes in more cities.
Right, and so there'll be this loyalty conflict. If only Joes are in our city, the city trusts Joes more. If there are Joes in other cities too, then there's less of an issue about whether we trust Joes here.
There might be a diversity of government styles between M nations.
Right, among the clans.
Among the clans.
Right, and for the cities, democracy is a little less feasible and autocracy is a little more feasible in the M world. And so that means on the margin they will use democracy less, they'll still use it.
But I'm allowed to maintain some kind of hopeful vision that there will be a Scottish M city somewhere in the Hebrides that still maintains the standards of the Enlightenment, and all the other M cities will have been turned into authoritarian hellholes.
They might be wonderful authoritarian worlds. Now,
yeah.
So leaders have some advantages over our leaders. A leader can be immortal, first of all. Secondly, a leader can protect themselves with a cadre of very loyal associates who are copies of themselves. So they are sure that the royal guards are very loyal.
They would all be Joes, actually. They
Exactly.
would be Uncle Joe Stalin. So Stalin could finally be surrounded by a Politburo
Right,
of
exactly.
other
So as long as Stalins
Yes.
get along with each other, then they will reassure each other by way. One M1 vote doesn't work very well because it's so easy to make very slow M's that are very cheap. So more likely you'd have speed-weighted voting for democracy.
Oh, let's spell this out, because otherwise, if I want to win the election, I will just make 1 million copies of myself that are very, very slow,
Slow
but
and
just,
cheap.
just fast enough to vote.
Make one vote, yeah.
And then I will end them.
Right.
Suicidal voter buying.
Right, so that just means you kind of buy elections by buying copies. So that doesn't work very well.
Doesn't work.
But speed-weighted voting might, which is the number of votes that a person has is their speed over the whole
Or
time since
one
the last
clan,
election
one
or something.
vote. I can see there's an entire chapter
Right, but you
there.
can see simple democracy has to have some variety there, okay? Another thing is you can trust leaders more in this world. So today, one of the problems with having an autarch is that the fact that you can't trust them. But, and one of the reasons why you can't trust them is they claim to have secrets. They can't tell you everything. But M's can tell you everything in ways that keep the secrets.
That's a nice crypto exercise. Yeah, please, do that. Yeah,
Okay.
that appeals to computer scientists.
Right, so
put names on them. We have an autarch called
So
Joe.
say the leader of your nation says we must invade our neighbor. Sorry, we must do the following military exercise. I can't tell you exactly why, but it's just necessary.
This is President George.
Right, and you are not sure you can trust George, right? In our world, you're just kind of stuck. And this is one of the problems with giving George too much power, is he might claim this and then do things for his own reasons. Now, in the world of M's, there's a nice, elegant solution, which is you say to George, I need you to explain your reasons to me. And so then a copy of George and a copy of you go inside of a safe, an enclosed safe, and inside the safe, they can explain all their reasons to you. And at the end, your copy of you has a job of choosing one bit. Was I persuaded or not? And then the only thing that comes out of the safe is that one bit back to you. Was I persuaded? So in the end, you can now hear, yes, he has a good reason, or no, he doesn't. And now you
After
don't know.
which-
And now the leader has a way to communicate to you that you should believe him. He says, we must invade. You do the safe test. You get the bit back that says, yes, he has a good reason.
We ended both copies in the safe,
inside the safe.
Yes,
But you have the bit back that says,
Yeah.
yes, there's a good reason, trust George.
So this will appeal to the cryptographers in the audience, because this is an example of a so-called zero-knowledge protocol. It's a protocol that you run. The cost here is actually just ending 2 copies of M's.
Right, and letting them run
otherwise
for a
it
short
works.
time, and it's
Yes.
actually relatively cheap. So in this way, M's can do really fine-grained sharing of secrets, in that they can share something that's based on other things and share just the result without the parts that it's based on, which means that leaders can be more trusted. And for example, a society might have limits on free speech. And you might think, well, why have these limits on free speech? And they might say, well, we can't explain the limits for free speech to you, otherwise we'd be talking about it, and that would be overcoming the problem here. But they can say, well, we can go into a safe, and you can explain these limits in free speech in the safe, and we can now decide
because the dangerous information would be something like building a bomb or something like
whatever
that.
it is, right? And now they can convince you that limits on free speech should be imposed via this process whereby the limits are relaxed inside the safe.
Yeah, Dave Robin, they will never convince me about the limits of free
Well,
speech.
we could find that out. We can
Yes,
see what
we
bit
could.
comes out.
We
That's
could.
the whole point.
Yes.
We'll see whether you're convinced or not, right?
I will resist that. So the M cities are now racks of containers containing computer hardware,
Dense racks
dense racks,
that are run as fast as they can without melting,
in the middle of the city, because we
right?
assume
And
that
so they need a lot of cooling. They need so much cooling, in fact, that I estimate roughly half of city volume is devoted to cooling pipes. You're really eager to cram cooling fluids in and out of this thing so that you can run this stuff as fast as possible. The simplest way to implement that is cold water with ice pellets. That's actually a way to have a lot of density of cooling power in a very ordinary material.
these are some of the easier chapters to write, right? Because we more or less understand how to cool
Although I had to learn some literature about to see this, but yes. So we know of efficient ways to cool large volumes where the overhead is logarithmic, actually. So you might think cities might be limited by just the fact it was just hard to cram enough cooling volume through it that you just couldn't make them very big. But it turns out we actually know efficient ways to cool large volumes with only a modest logarithmic overhead.
And then the fastest M's would be running in the middle of the city where the hardware is most expensive, and because they are extremely efficient.
Right, so we expect the price of volume to go up toward the middle and the price of energy to go up toward the middle because it's just harder to get things in and out of there. We also expect, say, the middle to be taller, and so weight gets more expensive higher up. And so we expect toward the middle, that's just a priority place where you pay more rent to be there. And so the ones who can afford to pay more would be the ones who are more valued and also run faster. Mm-hmm. And so there'd be just an ordinary spectrum. This is actually familiar in our cities today. People who are richer or more productive can afford central locations, and others have to be farther away.
Yeah. So the city does not really differ from a modern city in that sense.
Right.
Most of the efficiency is going to be in the middle.
Cities are taller in the middle. Cities are denser in the middle.
And most meetings are held in the middle of the city.
Right. Now these cities, though, are just crammed full of computer hardware. Yeah. And so, in reality, are kind of functional looking, but they see their cities in virtual reality. So they would see a mapping of their city that roughly had the same positions and relationships of things to be useful to them, but it doesn't have to be exactly faithful. It would be a beautified version of it, which would be inspiring and the city they see. So they might see gleaming spires and broad boulevards, shining sunlight, etc., because that's how they see their city. But functionally, they need to know where things are because they go places and they want to know what's fast to interact with, what's easy to get to, etc. Those are just things they need to know.
And outside of these M cities, we need to talk. We started talking about robots because not all the M's are living in virtual reality. Some of the M's we assume.
Whenever they're doing physical tasks, like they might be moving materials in a truck from one place to another, they might be running a mine, they may be managing a factory, they might be assembling computer hardware, perhaps disassembling old retired hardware. They will need to, at those times, be paying attention to the physical world and using physical actuators and physical sensors. But they don't need to permanently attach themselves to such things. So it's like us driving a car. When you need to drive a car, you get into a car and drive. And for the period that you're driving, it's as if the car was your body.
Right, and our brains seem to be really good at
understanding. And we can adapt
understanding
to a wide range of machines as if they were our body.
And we invent stories that this is actually my arm, even though it's a robot arm.
And we just map our senses and our arms and legs onto the machines we have. So people do that when they work steam shovels and work all sorts of machines. They treat them as if it was part of their body. So M's would just quickly be able to move into whatever machine was needed to do a task. It might be a spider shape, it might be something else, whatever it is that's for the task. But when they're done with the task and want to take a break, they can just go back to looking and feeling like a human because that's probably more comfortable.
Right. And the robots might be tiny in order to handle the piping systems in the middle of the city. Or
and then the speeds would be matched to whatever physical task they have. So the minds only need to be fast enough to control whatever the reaction time of the device they're working with is. Today, if you're driving a oil tanker, the reaction time is pretty slow. You don't actually need a very fast mind for something like that. But whenever action gets faster, maybe you speed up your mind to focus on a fast activity. So the minds of and also the body size is matched to the speed. So interesting, like our minds happen to be at roughly the right speed for our bodies. That is, we have a 1/10 of a second reaction time, which is roughly the fastest period we can produce in any of our fluctuations of our body.
As opposed to certain insects or very small birds.
But if we make our body 1,000 times smaller, then it can have fluctuations 1,000 times faster, and then you need a brain 1,000 times faster to manage it.
Animals like that exist.
Exactly. So M's were 1,000 times faster. If they want a body matched to their speed, it would be a body 1,000 times shorter than our body. And in that world, their body would feel natural in many ways, although some things would be different. Gravity feels much weaker when you're much smaller. Frictional resistance in water and air is much more bothersome. Fluctuations are more noticeable. Light has more, diffraction. There are some things that in smaller bodies they would notice as different, but in many ways it's like an ordinary body, smaller, faster.
And then outside of this partially robot-inhabited city of racks and racks of computer hardware, at least for a brief time, there may be biological humans walking around in the rest of Norway.
So I estimate the whole age of M to last a year or two, beyond which I'm not going to make predictions.
Yeah, that's, again, when you see this the first time, that seems dramatic. Why is it only a year? So from the outside.
Right, so I'm making analogies with the last eras we've seen, the era of animal brains, and then foragers, and then farmers, and then humans. Each of these eras lasted between 8 and 16 doublings before something else happened. And if the economy doubles every month, then in a year or two you see that many doublings. And so that's plausibly the scale at which something else would happen.
Because the M city runs maybe 1,000 times faster than 1 year
Right.
of actual human time.
It's 1,000 years for them.
And 1,000 years of M time will probably be technologically as advanced
Right,
as
so they would experience a lot of social change over 1,000 years.
just like we did from 1,000 years ago.
And so, again, that's how I set my boundaries in my analysis. I'm not predicting the entire future.
No.
I'm just predicting the next era after ours. That's pretty different, but not everything happens in that era. In particular, space colonization doesn't happen much.
Right, they don't care about going to the moon. That's also
Because they can't do very much in 2 years about that. In fact, they focus on a smaller section of the Earth. In fact, from the point of view of the M cities, other parts of the Earth were as if they're another part of the galaxy. They're just far away. They take a long time to get there. They're not very. They are hard to interact with.
Slow.
They might even be opaque and not even know what's happening there. If you know.
They might have stories about us, right? I guess
Right.
the M's would feel towards us like
Right.
we feel towards Shakespeare or
Right,
the
so
ancients.
in the way we think of a galaxy as a vast thing and things far away or unknown and strange, they could think of the Earth that way. The Earth becomes a vast thing with far away things unknown, because for them, as they get faster, the scales expand.
And when 8-year-old Tor 1 is spun up again from a copy and goes to school and learns about the history of its species and learns about, say, the Industrial Age and the Middle Ages, that M will be horrified, I guess, learning about a world where there is disease and filth.
Every era, including ours, tell a story about the past that are somewhat self-serving and emphasize the ways that their era looks favorable compared to the past. The farming world did that for foragers. The farming world saw themselves as civilized, and foragers were wild beasts, and farmers were proud of that difference, right? And then we today are more forager-like, and we're proud of how we are more self-realized and richer and comfortable and less violent, perhaps, than farming era people. So we each focus on the differences, and we tell an origin story of how the good people made our good world out of the old bad world through heroic frontiers and changes, right? And the M's will tell the same sort of stories about the heroic origin of their world and how their world is so much better in so many ways than even our world today and the worlds before. They will have nostalgia and perhaps gratitude for worlds before, but less respect, which is how we think about our ancestors as well, if you realize. We find stories interesting of our ancestors, but we often feel a little proud that we are smarter and more knowledgeable, and we think we're more moral than they were.
Morally superior, right. They are
and the M's will do that as well with us. So the M's will, first of all, focus on how much more productive they are. They are hardworking, they are smart, they are conscientious.
And take pride in that.
And they take strong pride in that, and they will see the biological humans and their ancestors as much lazier, stupider, less committed, less loyal, less they lied more, etc. Less knowing themselves, because the M's will be proud of the fact they understand themselves and they've come to terms with their limits and who they are. The M's will be proud of their productivity and their vast expansion of their capabilities and all the new things they've learned.
And they will happy about not having disease and
they
death.
will be okay with their Malthusian world. They will think of us as prissy, a little too, unwilling to deign ourselves to be like most humans who ever were, who had to work enough to survive. They will think of that as, they have to justify their existence. They should have to justify their existence. Almost everybody has to justify their existence. You industry era people think you are entitled to exist.
So the era we live in, you sometimes describe as dream time.
Dream time, yes.
That is
we are
us right now.
Unusual exception in history. We have a number of unusual characteristics that will make ours an interesting era to place stories in, but also able to be criticized from the outside. So there's in some ways in which the M's have things in common with our distant forager ancestors. One is they living at subsistence. They are in tune with their world. They're also going to be they're like farmers, they will be religious and loyal and self-controlled. And in the dream time, we are rich, and we feel like being rich means we no longer efface the constraints and things that our ancestors had. Our ancestors had to justify their existence by producing enough food to survive. They had to worry about military threats from outsiders. They had to worry about diseases killing them off. They had to not assume they could exist or should exist. They had to think, is our, say, nation militarily strong enough to resist an outsider? Are we inviting a threat by seeming lazy and et cetera? Are we being suspicious enough? And that just thought of that as their duty. But we today don't think that's our duty. We don't think it should have to be our duty.
Well, in this tiny window, which may just be a few generations, right?
So we can get away with not doing the things that our ancestors always had to do to survive, and that our descendants, we don't have to have as many babies as possible. We don't have to be prepared constantly for war. We don't have to make sure we can be as productive as possible so our children don't starve. These are things we feel entitled to be. We are entitled to search and self-discover ourselves and travel the world and pick the career that feels the most satisfying. And we feel this is the world that is our world, and we are entitled to it. And that's the dream time. And it's an exciting time to tell a story, and because characters in this world have a lot of freedom. As we said before, rich people, to decide what they do, you have to know what they want.
Right.
And so our characters do different things depending on what they want. Whereas a character in a world that's near subsistence mostly does what they want based on what they have to do.
Excellent. Did we cover everything?
Well, we didn't talk about software engineers. I don't know if you want to talk about that, but
let's talk about software engineers then. That's highly specific and maybe a good way to end this super brutal view of the future.
But it gives you another sort of concrete image.
Yeah, because the details here are really fascinating, and the more detail we add, the easier it becomes to think
imagine
about
the world, right? So, over the last half century, software engineering practice has changed because the cost of computer hardware, processing and memory has fallen by so many orders of magnitude. Long ago, you had to be very stingy with these things because they were very expensive.
Well, long ago there were no software engineers, right?
The discipline 70 years ago, right? Well, there were programmers, say.
There were programmers 70 years ago, and software engineering started as a discipline in the 70s, 80s.
Well, wherever you want to draw the line. But the key point is, long ago they had to pay very close attention to resources because it was very expensive.
Yes.
And so they spent a lot of thinking time for any one piece of code because it was important to get it right.
Fit it into 2 kilobytes of RAM.
And now, over time, as things get cheaper and cheaper, relatively the software engineer is expensive, and so they move up in levels of abstraction. They think at higher levels, and they make high-level descriptions, and those are automatically translated to low levels in relatively inefficient ways. But that doesn't matter so much because it's so cheap.
Let's just spell this out. So we are used to writing programming languages in higher and higher, more universal, increasingly functional programming languages, which are translated by a sequence of compilers down to assembly code. But I remember that when I started programming in 82 or something like that, I actually wrote in machine code.
Because you had to understand it a bit.
Yeah,
but today people don't even bother to understand the machine code. They just understand the higher level languages.
I certainly don't teach this at all, even though I did it and found it enjoyable.
So the nature of programming or software engineering has changed over the years because of the relative cost of hardware and software.
Absolutely.
Okay. There's also the subtler point of parallel hardware or serial hardware. So we can now, in the past these things went together, but in the last 10 or 15 years, the cost of serial hardware hasn't fallen so much, but the cost of parallel hardware has. So now it becomes cheaper and cheaper to write parallel programs relative to serial programs, and we more have to push people to try to figure out how to write in parallel if they can.
It's terrible.
Right, but the cost tempts you to try. But it's harder, which is why you don't want to. So now, for M's, who are the software engineers of this new world, they are implemented in computer hardware. And so now, when computer hardware falls by a factor of 2, both the cost of they and the cost of the computers they work for falls at the same rate.
The engineer is running on the substrate, on the very substrate
that they're
he or
programming
she
for.
is programming for. Right.
And so, and brains are also very parallel pieces of software. So basically, the cost of writing parallel software and the cost of an M stay at the same relative cost for a long time now. So instead of having radically different software styles over time as the relative costs change, now they would go at a back to the future moment where they went to some previous trade-off and then they stay there for a long time. So just before M's are possible, we'll have very expensive human software engineers.
Yes.
And all of a sudden we'll have much cheaper M software engineers. And now we'll be tempted to dig lower into the hardware to go back to a lower level because we'll be using much cheaper software engineers to program the computers. So that will be a back to the future moment where they go back to a previous style. And then they'll stay at that level for a long time as the relative trade-off stays there.
As opposed to becoming more valuable relative to the computer
Right,
hardware.
exactly. Now for serial programming, which is most of what we do today,
Yes.
in fact, the cost of the computer hardware will rise relative to the cost of the M hardware. So say an M was thinking of something thinking in their head or running a serial program to calculate something. Today they'll think, serial program is cheap enough, I'll just have it do that. In the future they might like switch back to doing it in their head because the serial hardware is getting relatively more expensive with time. They'll either have to find a way to write it in parallel code or to do it in their head. So that's the life of M software engineers, you see, has this back to the future moment and then a stability that we don't see in our world where relative costs stay more stable over time.
Excellent. Thank you for turning this back from swearing and robots and the sex life
Now,
of
the last thing
humans.
we should say is that we should talk about evaluating the world because we put that off,
We put that off very deliberately.
right? But we should come back to it.
I would be happy to. You seem to normally resist that exercise, but
But I want to make sure we directly address it.
go ahead.
Right. So now you should just realize that a century ago, if you had asked somebody to evaluate our world and told them about all the details, they would probably just love it or hate it based on the first few things they heard because your world is really just weird. And there are just some things they're likely to hate.
Oh, depending on whether I started with, say, gender equality or
the fact
absence,
the lack of religion, the lack of patriotism, which they would hate, or the fact that we don't have to work so much, which they might like, or the fact that we're inside a building and don't see nature so much, which they might dislike, or the fact that we are warm all winter, which they might like.
Our children don't die from disease, which they would love.
So depending on which things they heard, they might, because it's really hard to just get your head around a whole different world that's not your world.
Right. You need to understand it serially. You start somewhere and get one detail after the other, but the first detail cannot but inform your evaluation of the later details.
Right. So with that in mind, you should be cautious about reacting to any one thing in this description. You should be trying to hold judgment back and look at the whole package of all of it before you try to draw some judgments.
Traditionally, human brains seem to be really bad at that because
which is why I'm mentioning it and trying to call it attention. So, my first thing I'd say is this is a world that's more alien than our world from our original thing. So, one general trend in history is alienation increases. That is, the worlds we find ourselves in are just different from the worlds we were made for, and that means we have to be alienated to adapt to the world. So, it is a more alienated world, and that's a negative. But we're already in a pretty alien world at the moment compared to the worlds we grew up in. So we're already pretty far into alienation.
Certainly compared to 30,000 years ago, when we were also psychologically adapted to the environment.
Exactly, right. But I think our world is still okay, even if it's alienated.
The world that
we're living in right now.
Yes,
Yeah, right now,
great.
of course.
Yeah.
And I think even the farming world was okay relative to not existing. I think there were lives worth living on average. I mean, sometimes not, but mostly on average, lives worth living. They smiled, they were happy, they were recognizably human, having meaningful lives.
Some of them did,
right? And I think if we look across the wide variety of different cultures that have existed and the different lifestyles that have existed, even different classes, mostly they had lives worth living.
However, from my single vantage point, I would normally prefer my own life, but that's just
your
a bias.
lives might be better, right?
Yeah, but I'm also biased to sort of just invent my life being better.
But now, if your life is better, it's still probably not better by a factor of 100. It might be better by a factor of 2, at most 10, but not a factor of 100.
I think my life is a lot better than, say, King Louis XV, and his life would have
not by a factor of 100.
Not by a factor of 100. True. Good.
Okay.
Fine.
So that kind of bounds the relative scale here. And so if we look at a world of M's which has trillions of creatures, we have to say, we're not sure if their lives are as worth living as ours, but we're sure there's a lot more of them. And if you're willing to multiply the number of lives times the value per life, as long as there's more than 10 times many of them and they are less than 10 times less valuable, you kind of say it's an okay world. It's a world that you might not mind being replacing our world on that basis, at least. That's a weak kind of claim to make. So basically, it seems that humans are pretty adaptable to many different social circumstances. People find meaning and happiness in a pretty wide range of lives and worlds. It's not that nothing matters, it's that people are pretty adaptable. This is a common observation of, anthropology and sociology, that people are culturally adaptive. We find ways to find meaning and happiness in whatever world we show up in. As long as, we can have really miserable worlds, but like concentration camp or something. But,
slavery, for
right?
many people life is suffering.
Right, but honestly, I would even say most slaves in history had lives worth living. If you read their writings, you read the story of their lives, I gotta say most slaves seem to have had lives worth living. Even if it's better if they weren't slaves. So that's the rough basis on which I might argue for the value of the M world. I also, just another angle would just say, look, you shouldn't expect to be able to choose between radically different futures. You are just one small part of a large world. Mostly we aren't choosing the world at all. Mostly you should expect to be able to move the world slightly in one direction or another. So I think the question you should really ask is not which radically different future do I prefer, but in a scenario like this, which way would I prefer things to go? So I have some preferences about the M world, about which way I would prefer it to be moved if I could move it slightly.
So do I. So this gets back to a larger question that I've been thinking a lot about, this idea of the value of technological prophecy, because in some sense, so here's something I'm obsessing about currently. The idea of prophesizing the future seems to be the same fallacy as historicism. The idea that history proceeds along certain laws and can be understood as a function of these laws, and then we, which I think is a mistake. This is called the poverty of historicism sometimes. And in the same sense, the future is not a single place that we can predict. So then you offer this alternative that there may be various futures. One of them is the M world. Right. And then you can predict this place. Again, you're not making the mistake of thinking of this place as a static thing that we arrive at.
There's a distinction between which future we can predict will happen and whatever will happen, how much control do we have individually on what will happen. So there could be a wide range of things that could happen that from our point of view we can't tell which will happen. Now, one of them will happen. And counterfactually, if we did one thing or another, a different future would happen.
Right.
And the question is, how big a difference is that? So I'm arguing for that second thing as a small difference, even if the first thing is a wide range. There's a wide range of possible futures, but you yourself shouldn't expect to be able to make a big difference between them. You yourself should expect to make a small difference to the future. And so you should think about what small differences you prefer. That's the useful choice you can make. That is, for any one scenario, which direction you want it to move. And you can think usefully about that, and then you could usefully act to push in that direction. Now, if there are multiple futures, any one action might produce a different outcome in the different futures, and now you have to make a judgment on which is more likely to decide which way to push.
Because we're not claiming that we can predict the effect of this push, right? Because in general, it's very difficult to predict social change just from...
But I might say, if the age of M is what happens, then what changes would you like to see to it? Now, to make other actions today, you'll have to say, but how sure am I that this is a scenario versus others? And you'll wonder how robust any action choice is across that. But that's a wider scope than we have time for. But we could at least ask, in this world, what would you prefer to see? And I have some obvious preferences about this world.
You will tell us?
Yes. So one obvious preference is, if M's were initially enslaved and badly treated by humans, it won't go well for the biological humans later on when the M's are in full control.
Because this is one of the questions that I often get. Why would these M's, why can't we just treat them as slaves? Yes.
That's a gamble that you can maintain that level of control. If you lose that level of control, then humans are quite vulnerable to the M's. So the M's are fundamentally more productive, smarter, faster, cleverer. The economic pressures will be to let them run 1,000 times faster than humans. So human oversight will have to be at a very high level. M's will have to be authorized to make a lot of pretty detailed choices. It doesn't work that well having slaves with that much discretion.
And slavery doesn't work very well anyway, right? Compared to, say, just unfettered capitalism.
Well, in history, we've had periods when land was scarce and when labor was scarce. When labor is scarce, wages are high, and there's a point to having slaves because it costs less to feed a slave than to hire a free worker. But when land is scarce and labor is plentiful, wages fall to a subsistence level, and there's no point to owning a slave. The value of a slave is near zero because it costs as much to feed a slave as it does to hire a free worker. So the Age of M is that sort of situation where there's not much point to owning a slave because they're already as cheap as they could get because of the plentiful M workers. Now,
yes, it's wonderful that we can avoid slavery by having a world that is even more terrible.
Now, there have been times in the past where, say, you could get more work out of a slave than a free worker because you could, say, torture them to work harder than a free worker might work. That worked best in relatively simple physical tasks like picking cotton or something. When we went to, say, house slaves or city slaves who had much more complicated jobs and needing a lot more discretion, they were typically given as much freedom and treated as well as free workers because otherwise it didn't go well. So basically there's not that much point.
No, and torturing a programmer doesn't make any sense, especially if the programmer lacks programming. Then
and especially again, what we'd like is for the history of the transition to be the M's being grateful for the humans for helping to enable and create the transition. The source who created and helped. Us being the resistors and dominators that they had to escape from doesn't work very well for them treating humans better later. The other thing I would really like out of the transition is that there's a danger that initially the M world will look at the currently most productive humans at the time, which are, say, Ivy League school graduates who are mostly white, male, upper class people, and fill the M world with copies of those. And basically most of the rest of the Earth's culture has very little heritage in the M world. That's a scenario that could happen if there's just an eagerness to grab the very few productive and not much of an eagerness to go search in the space of the rest of humans for productive M's. And especially if there's some sort of cultural matching where the other humans are just not well matched culturally to the ones who are initially the popular ones who then are sufferers because of that. So I would really prefer if once it becomes possible to create M's, that they search far and wide for human children who are promising M's. And that needs, so there's a really strong cultural obstacle here, which could prevent this, which is initially brain scans to create M's will be destructive. They will destroy the brains in the process.
Oh, destroy as in kill.
Yes, exactly. And secondly, very quickly the M economy will, instead of preferring humans at the peak of their career as a lawyer or engineer or professor of algorithms, they will prefer, say, 5-year-olds who are flexible and able to learn the new different jobs needed in the M world. So we have the prospect of the M economy going around to the parents of the world saying, could we destructively scan your 5-year-old child?
Oh, and now I have the hope of ending this conversation with having Robin Hanson tell us some positive, good values, and then we are at a system that tries to find 5-year-olds to kill. Let's go on.
Right, but the whole point is, we're asking to scan your 5-year-old child to give it a chance to becoming a successful M.
Yes.
But most of them will fail this, they will be unsuccessful, but we are doing this as a way, and you can imagine many nations in the world initially just saying no.
Oh, you're saying that this selective pressure is going to select certain cultures.
Right. If many cultures refuse to allow their 5-year-old child to be scanned for an important period, say a year in human time, while they think about it, which is a millennia in M time, by the time Nigeria approves its 5-year-old children to be scanned, it may be such a cultural mismatch between the people who have now been M's for 1,000 years in this world that they may not have much of an opportunity to join and compete.
Because let's just spell this out, because the M world will have now suddenly been populated by a particularly poor but highly educated Southeast Asian city that just found it useful to maybe force, because it was an authoritarian government, to force
whatever random reason they approved it and other people didn't.
And then we have an M world that is selected from a very narrow
part of the humanity.
And that would be not very good. It would also not be the M world would not be incentivized to do that. Okay, but you're telling me there may be other reasons that the M world doesn't control that mean that their access to intelligent 5-year-olds...
So, exactly. Initially, the M world will be a small part of the world. It will be making peace with the humans. It will be compromising and accommodating the humans as best it can to prosper, and that may be accommodating arbitrary, perhaps regretful limitations that parts of the world place on who can try to be an M.
And this observation you make because this might actually be something that we could usefully avoid if we think
perhaps,
about it.
right. The warning is, if you take too long to wonder whether to allow your people to be scanned to become M's, you may be preventing them from populating and being at least part of them being a successful part of the M world.
For the brief part in which this society will exist. Yes.
Well, so the interesting thing, if the M world lasts only a year or two in human time, human behavior is very easy to predict. Human culture can hardly change in a year or two. All of a sudden, everybody loses their job. A lot of them get really rich fast, and that's all that happens to humans. And so that's actually relatively easy to predict, because we've seen in history what happens when people get rich and they don't have to work and they decide to do something for a couple of years. We've seen the range of that sort of thing, so that's what happens to humans.
Well, on that happy note, I think we can end it.
Thoughtful note, at least.
On that
It's very, very nice chatting, and I hope our listeners are now scratching their heads wondering, does this make any sense whatsoever?
Or buy a copy of the book, The Age of M, by Robin Hanson, now available in paperback.
Now available in
as
paperback.
well. Robin, thanks a lot for coming.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks for listening.